The desert air smelled like gun oil and arrogance. She stood 5'4" in worn boots, no rank on her collar, no bravado in her eyes. And every man in that training yard had already decided she didn't belong. They laughed when she arrived. They laughed when she stayed quiet. They laughed when she said, "Walk away." They stopped laughing 11 seconds later. 3 of the facility's top-rated operators were on the ground. One was cradling his wrist. One couldn't stand up. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody understood what she was. Not yet. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Drop a like, hit follow, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The military transport van that delivered Avery Stone to Iron Ridge Tactical Center arrived 40 minutes late, coated in red Nevada dust, and making a noise from the front axle that suggested it had no business being on federal property. She was the last one out. The other personnel who'd ridden with her, 2 Army Rangers, a Navy SO candidate, and a logistics officer who kept checking his phone, had already grabbed their bags and dispersed toward the processing building. Avery climbed out slowly, not because she was tired, but because she always moved like she was accounting for something, like she was reading the ground before she committed her weight to it. Iron Ridge sat at the edge of a dry basin 40 miles northeast of nothing. The facility was a loose sprawl of cinder block buildings, vehicle bays, obstacle courses, and a central parade ground that the Nevada sun had been bleaching white for 30 years. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire ran the perimeter. Guard posts at the corners. Security cameras on every roofline. A water tower to the east with a faded military seal stenciled near the top, half peeled from the wind. She stood with her bag on the gravel and looked at it all for a moment. Not admiring it, not intimidated by it, just reading it. The way someone reads a room they've been in before in a different life. "You lost?" The voice came from a man leaning against a support post near the main entrance. Late 30s, wide through the shoulders, tan from real sun exposure rather than a gym solarium. He had the look of someone who'd spent enough time in uniform to walk like one even after the uniform came off. Staff Sergeant Brennan Okafor, she would learn later. One of the senior range instructors at the facility. "Processing building?" she asked. He pointed without moving his arm much. "That way. You'll want to hurry. Intake briefing already started." "Thanks." She walked past him. He watched her go, squinting slightly like he was trying to figure out which list she was on. Quote, the processing room smelled like industrial cleaner and a coffee machine that needed descaling. 12 people were already seated in folding chairs arranged in 3 rows when Avery pushed through the door. A master sergeant named Doyle was mid-sentence at the front of the room, pointing to a laminated facility map on a corkboard. Range access is restricted between 2200 and 0400 unless there's a scheduled night training block. Any request for extended range hours goes through Instructor Pierce or myself, not through each other, not through the quartermaster, not through anyone else. Questions so far? Nobody had any. Avery found an empty chair in the second row and sat down. The man beside her glanced over, looked at her once, and looked back at the front of the room. That was fine. She wasn't there to make friends. Doyle continued through the briefing. Housing assignments, mess hall schedules, PT formation times, radio protocol, the chain of reporting for safety violations. Standard intake. Avery had sat through 100 versions of it at a dozen different facilities. She listened anyway because sometimes the way people deliver standard information tells you more than the information itself. Doyle was efficient but nervous around the edges. His eyes kept cutting left, toward the door that led to the instructor offices, as though he was expecting someone to walk through it and correct him. Whoever that someone was, they walked through the door 12 minutes later. His name was Logan Pierce. He was the reason Avery was here. Not directly, not personally, but in the systemic sense. Pierce ran the Advanced Combatives and Tactical Integration Program at Iron Ridge, a joint service initiative designed to prepare operators from different branches to work together in high-stress combined operations. It was a good program on paper. In practice, it had a reputation that moved through the military community in quiet, specific ways. The kind of reputation people referenced obliquely, in hallways, with their backs turned to security cameras. Pierce was 6'2" and built like someone had welded a man out of competition ego and Marine Corps attrition. He had a deep tan, short-cropped hair, and a way of standing in a room like he was measuring it for something he intended to fill. He looked at the group assembled in the folding chairs, let his eyes move across them with the casual authority of someone who had done this 100 times and found it tedious, and then his gaze landed on Avery. It stayed there a half-second too long. "New intake," he said to Doyle, not really asking. "Yes, sir. 14 personnel. All assignments confirmed through J3. Pierce picked up the attendance roster from the table, scanned it, and set it back down. "We'll start physical assessments tomorrow at 05:30. I want to know what I'm working with." He looked at the group again, and when his eyes came back to Avery a second time, something shifted in his expression. Something practiced enough to look casual, sharp enough to be deliberate. "Get some sleep," he told the group. "You'll need it more than you think." He walked back out the door he'd come through. The room exhaled slightly. Housing at Iron Ridge consisted of 2 long barracks buildings flanking a central courtyard. Avery's bunk was in the East Barracks, 3rd from the end, a bottom rack she claimed by setting her bag on it before anyone else arrived. Her bunkmates were 2 women, a signals specialist named Torres with a dry sense of humor and a talent for card games, and a Marine Corpsman named Wicks, who had arrived 2 days earlier and had already identified which of the facility's vending machines gave extra time before registering a purchase. "You the combat medic?" Wicks asked, dropping onto her own bunk and pulling off her boots. "Yeah. Pierce is going to make your first week interesting." "I've had interesting weeks." Wicks looked at her. Something in the answer made her pause, like she'd been expecting pushback or anxiety and got neither. "Okay," she said, and left it there. Torres was at the small desk near the window, shuffling a deck of cards with the absent mechanical ease of someone who's been doing it since childhood. "Where are you transferring from?" she asked without looking up. "Medical Training Detachment out of Bragg." "What branch?" "Army." "And they sent you here for the Joint Integration Program." "That's right." Torres finally looked up. She had sharp eyes, the kind that notice discrepancies between what people say and how they hold themselves when they say it. She looked at Avery for a moment, then went back to her cards. "Okay," she said, same as Wicks. Avery appreciated that. She turned off her bunk light at 2100, lay in the dark, listening to the desert wind move across the roof, and thought about the map she'd seen tacked to the processing room wall. She'd already memorized the facility layout. Old habit. Physical assessment began before sunrise, the sky still a deep bruised purple when the intake group assembled on the parade ground in PT gear. The Nevada air at 4 degrees before dawn carries a chill that contradicts everything the desert implies. Sharp, dry, getting into your throat. Most people tightened their layers, a few stomped their feet. Avery stood still. Pierce arrived with 2 of his senior instructors, Brennan Okafor, who Avery recognized from the entrance yesterday, and a compact, humorless man named Garrett, who seemed to do most of his communicating through the set of his jaw. "You've all been through intake PT in your respective units," Pierce said, moving down the line without stopping. "This isn't that. This is diagnostic. I need to know what you can actually do, not what you've been trained to say you can do. Instructors Okafor and Garrett will be observing and scoring. I'll be watching. Nobody coaches during assessment. Questions?" Nobody had any. Smart enough group for that. The assessment ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. Standard enough in structure. A timed run, obstacle course, weighted carry, then combat fitness stations that tested grip, push capacity, core stability, and explosive movement. What made it different was the overlay. Every element was scored against an integrated rubric that weighted efficiency of movement over raw performance numbers. They weren't measuring who was fastest, they were measuring who wasted the least. That distinction mattered. Avery had known it would. She ran her 1.5 miles in 11 minutes and change. Not the fastest in the group, not by a stretch. A ranger candidate named Decker crossed 2 minutes ahead of her, high-stepping through the finish with visible satisfaction. 2 others beat her time as well. But on the obstacle course, something changed. It wasn't that she was dramatically faster. It was that she was never where you expected her to be, and every transition, from the low crawl to the wall climb, from the rope traverse to the beam walk, happened without reset. No hesitation, no repositioning. Like she'd already run the course in her head before her body committed to it. Okafor made a mark on his clipboard. At the weighted carry station, 60 pounds in a field pack, 400 meters, she finished third. At the grip stations, she held longer than expected. At the ground fighting assessment, she was paired with a stocky signals officer who outweighed her by 60 pounds. And when Garrett blew the whistle to start, she moved immediately, efficiently, and the signals officer found himself on his back in under 8 seconds, looking confused about the sequence of events that had led him there. Garrett didn't write anything. He just watched. Pierce hadn't moved during the ground assessment. He stood with his arms crossed, expression unreadable, watching Avery climb to her feet and reset her posture. Then he turned and said something quietly to one of his instructors. Whatever it was, it made the instructor smirk. Musset. It started that afternoon. Nothing dramatic at first. That wasn't how it worked at facilities like Iron Ridge. It started with the particular kind of social machinery that runs in groups of competitive, hierarchical people when they collectively decide that someone doesn't belong. At the mess hall, Avery set her tray down at a table with 3 open seats, and 2 of the people already seated there moved their equipment to fill them without making eye contact. She found another table. She ate. At the afternoon equipment issue, her gear allocation came up incomplete, missing the tack vest components that the rest of the intake group received. She reported it to the quartermaster, who checked his list and told her there was no record of the discrepancy. "My issue sheet shows everything signed out," the QM said, not unkindly, just with the particular exhaustion of someone who doesn't want to be involved. "It does show that," Avery agreed, "but the items aren't here. I'll put in a replacement request." "How long?" 48, 72 hours. Depends on supply." She nodded and walked out. In the training bay that afternoon during the first group tactical exercise, she was assigned as the odd element in a 3-man fire team, technically correct in number, but positioned in the formation where her role as medic would require her to move through 2 other team sectors to provide support, a configuration that would have been flagged as tactically unsound in any competent after-action review. Nobody flagged it. She adapted. The exercise ran 90 minutes. Her team completed the objectives. When Instructor Garrett scored the debrief, he highlighted one movement decision, hers, as a tactical error. She listened, didn't respond, and looked at the scenario map on the wall where the actual movement lines were drawn. The error was the only route that kept her out of the simulated kill zone given the team's positioning. She didn't say that, but Pierce found the first moment he could use. It was day 3. The group was running a force-on-force drill in one of the facility's CQB structures, a 2-story building with adjustable room configurations, painted on windows, and a series of scenario objectives designed to test decision-making under pressure. Simunition rounds. Helmets and face protection. Heart rate elevated, senses narrowed. Avery's team cleared the first floor without taking casualties. On the stairs to the second floor, she heard movement she wasn't supposed to be able to hear through the building noise, and she called a halt signal. A closed fist raised at shoulder level. Her team stopped. The threat she'd heard moved to a different position. Better position for them. Worse for her team. She signaled a direction change. The team followed. They avoided what would have been a direct fire contact in a fatal funnel and took the objective through an alternate breach. In the debrief, Pierce made it the centerpiece. "Stone," he said, standing at the whiteboard where the building layout was diagrammed, "explain your halt call on the stairs." Heard movement on the second floor, non-standard pattern for a static defensive position. Changed approach to avoid the funnel. "You heard movement?" "Yes." "Through a simulated kinetic environment with 2 other operators moving beside you." She looked at him. "Yes." Pierce let a smile happen. It wasn't warm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the room, "that's what we call an explanation that sounds better than it performs. The standard breach protocol, which everyone else followed, cleared that structure in 11 seconds faster than Stone's improvised alternative. In a real-world scenario, 11 seconds is a significant tactical disadvantage. It's also a significant advantage, Avery said, over getting hit in a funnel. The room went very still. Pierce turned back to look at her. "Excuse me?" "I said—" She paused, kept her voice even. "It's also a significant advantage over taking simunition hits in a fatal funnel because of an auditory cue the team didn't have time to assess. I made a judgment call. I'd make it again." The stillness in the room had a texture to it now. People didn't breathe in quite the same way they had 5 seconds ago. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. "Right," he said. "We'll reassess your tactical judgment at the next live exercise." It was not a compliment. The harassment moved from ambient to operational within the week. Avery's radio was returned from the equipment bay with a degraded battery that hadn't been on her issue sheet, small enough to be plausible as oversight, significant enough to matter in a field exercise. She caught it during pre-mission gear check and swapped it before anyone could note that she'd been issued defective equipment. A training report with her name on it documented a firearms qualification she hadn't completed, scored lower than her actual performance, filed by Instructor Garrett and co-signed by Pierce without her signature in the acknowledgement block, a procedural violation that would ordinarily trigger an internal review. Nobody initiated one. In PT formation, the cadence calls began including specific phrasings, not overtly insulting, just pointed, comments about team members who couldn't carry their weight, about people who confused luck with skill. Decker, who had apparently decided that allying with Pierce's orbit was in his professional interest, picked them up and ran with them. He had a knack for it, smart enough to be deniable, specific enough to land. "Looking a little winded there, Stone," he said during a 10-mile ruck, pulling up beside her with his pack sitting high and his tone sitting low. "Want me to carry something for you?" "I'm good." "You sure? Facility has a light-duty policy if you need—" "I said I'm good." He dropped back, but she could hear him say something to the man beside him, and then a short laugh. She didn't react. She'd learned a long time ago that reacting to that specific category of provocation was exactly what the provocation was designed to produce. The reaction was the point. Give them the reaction, and they owned the moment. They owned the narrative. They could replay it, amplify it, and use it to build the architecture of a story where she was the problem. She didn't give them the reaction. What she did was run the ruck in silence, track her own split times against the terrain, and arrive at the index marker 40 seconds inside her target window, breathing harder than she'd like, but standing straight. Okafor was at the marker with a stopwatch. He didn't say anything when she crossed. He looked at the time, looked at her, and made a mark on his clipboard in a way that was slightly different from how he'd been making marks all week. She noticed. She was good at noticing. By the end of week 2, Avery understood the facility's ecosystem with the clarity that comes from having operated in dozens of different institutional environments. Every large group under sustained pressure develops a social architecture. Not formally, not by design, but inevitably. There are those who hold authority, those who enforce it, those who benefit from proximity to both, and those who the whole structure pushes toward the margin. The margin had a specific function. It absorbed the pressure that the structure generated, gave the people near the top a reference point for their own position, and kept the group's internal momentum pointed outward, toward the margin, toward her. She wasn't the first person to occupy it at Iron Ridge, and she wouldn't be the last. She kept her gear organized, her reports filed correctly, her scores exactly where her performance put them. She didn't cultivate allies. She didn't avoid people. She was simply, consistently, precisely there, completing every task assigned to her, making no complaint she couldn't document, and watching. Torres, from 3 bunks over, brought her coffee one morning without asking if she wanted it. Avery took it. "You doing okay?" Torres asked. "Yeah." "Gear issue resolved?" "Mostly." Torres sat on the edge of her own bunk, coffee in hand. "For what it's worth," she said, "Garrett's been known to file paperwork on people he doesn't like. It's happened before. The last person it happened to requested transfer inside 2 months. Avery looked at her. "What happened to them?" "They left." "What happened to the paperwork?" Torres was quiet for a moment. "Stayed on their record." Avery nodded. "Thanks for the coffee." The afternoon it crossed the line was a Thursday, week 3, during a break between range sessions. Avery was at the south end of the training yard doing a gear inventory on the concrete divider wall when Pierce came across the yard with Decker and 2 other trainees, Hollis and a man named Cruz, who'd been consistently positioned in Pierce's immediate social orbit. It wasn't unusual for Pierce to move through the training area. What was unusual was the direction. He was coming specifically toward her, and the four of them had the unhurried, purposeful movement of people who had already decided how this was going to go. She kept her inventory going. Pierce stopped 6 feet away. He let the silence sit there for a moment the way confident men sometimes do when they believe the silence is doing work for them. "Stone," she looked up. "How are you finding the program?" he asked. His tone had a particular quality. Surface pleasantry with nothing beneath it, the conversational equivalent of a painted-on window. "Fine," she said. "Fine." He repeated it like it was mildly interesting. "Good to hear, because I've been reviewing your performance assessments, and there are some concerns." He tilted his head slightly. "Combat application score is in the acceptable range, but your team integration metrics are low. People have difficulty working with you." She held his gaze. "My team completed every objective in the last 4 exercises." Completion isn't the same as integration. He glanced at Decker, who was standing to his left with his arms folded, performing attentiveness. "The program isn't just about individual performance. It's about whether someone can function as part of a unit, and right now the feedback I'm getting suggests you might not be a good fit." "I'd want to see that feedback in writing," she said. Something moved behind Pierce's eyes. Not quite surprise, but an adjustment, like a recalibration. "That's not how preliminary assessments work," he said. "If it's informing decisions about my status in the program, I'd want it in writing." Pierce took 1 step closer. "Here's what I'd want," he said quietly, dropping the surface pleasantry entirely, letting the actual thing underneath show. "I'd want people who belong here to stay, and people who don't to make good choices before I have to make them for you. That's what I'd want." The desert wind came across the yard. Dust moved. Decker unfolded his arms. Avery set down the gear item she'd been holding, straightened, and looked at Pierce with an expression that didn't have hostility in it, or fear, or concession. Just a kind of level, steady attention that some people find more unsettling than any of those other things. "Walk away," she said. Pierce blinked. Decker made a sound in his throat, half laugh, half something else. "Excuse me?" Pierce said. "I've got an inventory to finish." She picked up the gear item again. "Walk away." The moment stretched. Then Pierce smiled, the wrong kind of smile, and turned and walked back across the yard with his orbit following him. She heard Decker say something, and then laughter, and then the sound of it carrying across the concrete and then disappearing. She went back to her inventory. She'd noted the way Pierce's hand had moved when she told him to walk away. A subtle thing, almost nothing. But she'd been watching hands in high-pressure situations for long enough to know what almost nothing sometimes preceded. She added it to the picture she was building. 2 days later, she was crossing the south training yard at dusk, heading from the range back to the barracks, when the situation changed from institutional harassment to something more direct. They'd been waiting. Not at the south yard, she'd have seen them. At the junction between the south yard and the maintenance lane that ran behind the vehicle bays. The lane was unlit at that hour, the facility's motion sensor lights having been reported out of service 2 days ago, a maintenance ticket that hadn't been resolved. Pierce wasn't there. Pierce was smart enough not to be there. But Decker was. And Hollis. And Cruz. And 4 others she recognized from the facility. 2 from Pierce's cadre, 2 from the intake group who'd been performing the specific social function of ambient reinforcement over the past 3 weeks. 7 of them. She stopped when she understood the geometry of the situation. They had closed the lane in both directions, 3 behind her, 4 ahead. The vehicle bays to her left, the maintenance fence to her right. Decker was in front. He had his arms loose at his sides, the way people carry themselves when they've decided something is already decided. "You've made this place difficult," he said. She looked at the spacing, distances between them, the fence, the bay entrance 12 feet to her left. "I haven't done anything to this place," she said. "Pierce is putting you on report. Full remediation package. You'll be out of the program in a week, and your file's going to look like you washed out." He shrugged. "Better if you request a voluntary transfer now. Looks better." She looked at him. "Or," he said, "we can have a different conversation." The desert was very quiet. She thought about how it had been 3 years since she'd been in a situation with a geometry this specific. 3 years since she'd had to read spacing and positioning the way she was reading it now. She thought about whether this was the moment she wanted it to be, and what it would mean afterward, and how Okafor had been marking his clipboard differently, and how whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would determine what happened in the next 60 days. She thought about all of that in about 4 seconds. Then she looked at the 7 men arranged around her in the failing Nevada light, and she said the same 2 words she'd said 3 days ago. "Last chance!" Decker laughed. 2 of the men behind her started moving, and then the training yard at Iron Ridge Tactical Center had a problem it hadn't anticipated, not because of what Avery Stone did, but because of what she stopped doing. She stopped measuring. She stopped calculating. She stopped deciding. She simply moved. The first man who reached her, one of the 2 from behind, coming in fast on her right, caught an elbow redirection that turned his momentum against him and sent him into the fence with enough force to knock the breath out of him. The second came in from the left half a second behind, and she was already moving laterally, not back, using the bay entrance she'd marked as an anchor point. And what he caught was a frame break followed by a hip transition that put him face down on the concrete before he'd processed that contact had been made. Decker was moving now, Hollis beside him. She didn't retreat. She moved forward toward them, which is always the wrong thing to do in the movies, and is frequently the right thing to do in reality, because it destroys the spacing they'd set up and forces individual engagement rather than coordinated group pressure. Hollis reached her first, big, fast, trained. She could see all 3 in his approach. She used all 3 against him. His size meant leverage, his speed meant overcommitment, and his training meant she could predict the sequence. She was 3 moves ahead when the first contact happened, and what the other men watching saw was something that looked almost like Hollis chose to go down. He hadn't chosen anything. He was just finished. Decker was better than the others. She knew he would be. She'd been watching him for 3 weeks. He was fast, cautious, and controlled, which made him harder. He came in low, and he didn't overreach, and he was doing something right up until he wasn't. And the transition between those 2 states happened in the space between one breath and the next. He hit the ground hard on his shoulder. He didn't get up right away. The remaining 3 men had stopped. They were looking at what was around them, at Hollis, at the 2 from behind, at Decker. And then they were looking at her, and she was standing in the center of the maintenance lane, exactly where she'd been when this started, and she wasn't breathing the way you breathe when you've been in a fight. She was breathing the way you breathe when you've been on a long run. Nobody said anything. She walked through the space they'd left between them and continued toward the barracks. Behind her, someone said something in a low voice. She couldn't make it out. Then nothing. The desert absorbed the rest. What the security footage from the one operational camera at the edge of the vehicle bay would later show was less than 70 seconds of recording. Most of what happened fell outside the camera's narrow field of view. What was visible in the grainy, thermal-compensated night footage was the beginning and the end. 7 men assembling in the maintenance lane, and then, sometime later, 5 of them on the ground in varying positions, and 1 figure walking away through the far end of the frame. The footage was reviewed the following morning by Okafor, who had been doing a routine equipment log check when the camera's timestamp flagged an anomaly. He watched it twice. He didn't call Pierce. He didn't file a standard incident report. What he did was place a secure call to a number that wasn't on the facility's internal directory. The person on the other end picked up on the second ring. "She's here," Okafor said, "and they just pushed her." The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" Okafor looked at the frozen frame on his screen, the empty maintenance lane, the figures on the ground. 7 of them, he said. She walked away. Another silence. Longer. "Don't let them push her again," the voice said. "I'm coming." Okafor hung up. He sat in the equipment room for a long moment, looking at the camera feed, then at the secure contact list on his personal phone. The name above the number he'd called didn't match any rank or assignment anywhere in the Iron Ridge facility manifest. It read simply, Hale, M. And that name, those 4 letters and 1 initial, meant something specific in certain circles. Something that would have fundamentally rearranged the assumptions of every person at this facility, starting with Logan Pierce. But the morning was quiet, and the facility didn't know yet what was already moving toward it. The morning after the maintenance lane, Iron Ridge woke up the way facilities wake up, after something happens that everyone knows about and nobody is officially acknowledging, with a specific quality of quiet. Not peaceful quiet, loaded quiet. The kind that sits in messes halls and briefing rooms and stretches between people who are deciding in real time how much they saw and what they're going to say about it. Avery was at PT formation at 0520, same as every other morning. Her boots were laced, her gear was squared. She stood in the second rank and stared at the middle distance while Garrett called cadence, and nothing about her posture indicated that the night before had been anything other than unremarkable. Decker was not at formation, neither was Hollis. Cruz was there, standing in the front rank with the particular careful stillness of someone managing pain they don't want witnessed. He didn't look at her. Nobody in Pierce's orbit looked at her directly, which was different from the way they'd been not looking at her before. Previously, the avoidance had been contemptuous, a performance of her not being worth attention. Now it was something else, something with more edges to it. Pierce ran the formation himself that morning. That was unusual. He typically left early PT to his instructors and appeared later when there were decisions to make and people to watch making them. But he was there at 0520, standing at the front of the formation in the gray pre-dawn, and he took the group through a 6-mile run at a pace that was aggressive enough to tell anyone paying attention that he was working something off. Avery ran in the middle of the pack and didn't push for a faster position. She had learned that specific discipline years ago. Not from a trainer, but from a situation in which being visible at the front of something had nearly gotten her killed. Some lessons you learn in classrooms. Some you learn in places that don't have names on official maps. She ran and she thought, and she cataloged. Okafor had been at his office window when she'd walked past the equipment building this morning. She'd seen him there. He hadn't waved, hadn't acknowledged her, but he'd been watching in the specific way of someone who is tracking a situation rather than just observing it. She filed that. The secure call he'd made last night, she hadn't been able to hear the conversation, but she'd seen him make it. Seen him step away from the standard bank of facility phones and use a personal device. Seen the way he'd held it. The posture of someone reporting up a chain rather than calling a peer. She filed that too. The name Hale meant something. She knew that without knowing why she knew it, which was itself information. It meant the name existed in a part of her memory that didn't get regular traffic. Deep storage. The kind where things went when you'd been deliberately not thinking about them for a long time. She let it sit. She kept running. The official version of the previous night's events took shape by mid-morning, and it was a version that Avery had to admire for its architecture even as she recognized what it was designed to do. Decker had filed a report from the medical bay where he'd gone early that morning for what was logged as a training-related shoulder strain. His report described an altercation in the maintenance lane initiated by Avery Stone, in which he and other trainees had attempted to de-escalate an aggressive encounter and sustained injuries in the process. The language was careful. It didn't claim she'd attacked without provocation outright. It framed the provocation question as ambiguous, which was more dangerous than a direct accusation because it was harder to refute cleanly. Hollis filed a corroborating statement. So did 2 of the others. Pierce called her into his office at 10:00. The office was small, functional, a desk and 2 chairs and a whiteboard with a training schedule on it. Pierce was behind the desk when she came in. Garrett was standing to the right of the door. Not sitting, standing, which was a positioning choice that she noticed and interpreted correctly as intentional. "Close the door," Pierce said. She did. She didn't take the chair he hadn't offered. She stood in front of the desk with her hands at her sides and waited. "I have 5 incident reports on my desk," Pierce said. "All filed this morning, all describing the same event. You want to tell me your version?" 7 trainees blocked a facility access lane after dark, she said. "I passed through." "You passed through?" "Yes." Pierce leaned back slightly. "Stone, I've got people in the medical bay. I've got documented injuries. I've got 5 sworn statements. I'd like to file my own statement." "You'll have the opportunity." He picked up a paper from his desk, looked at it, set it down. "What I need to understand right now is whether this is a pattern of behavior I should be concerned about or an isolated incident that we can address through remediation." "The pattern of behavior you should be concerned about," she said, "is the pattern that produced 7 people blocking a facility lane after dark. That's the report I'd like to file." Garrett shifted his weight near the door, a small movement, barely perceptible. Pierce studied her. "You understand that with 5 statements against 1, the remediation package defaults to the account with corroboration." I understand that's how you'd like it to work, she said. The temperature in the room changed. Pierce set both hands flat on the desk. I'm going to give you an opportunity here, Stone. Request voluntary transfer. I'll process it clean. No remediation flag, training program mismatch, standard language. You walk away, your record stays clean, and we put this behind us. That's a reasonable offer. She looked at him for a moment. He had the expression of someone who believed he was being generous. File my statement request in writing, she said. I'll have my account to you by 1500. She turned, opened the door, and walked out past Garrett, who watched her go with an expression she couldn't see from where she was, but that Okafor, passing in the hallway outside, could. He watched Garrett watch her, and then he went back to his office and sat down heavily in his chair and stared at his ceiling for 30 seconds. Then he pulled out his personal phone again and sent a single text. Faster would be better. The remediation package landed in her official file by 1445 minutes before she'd been given to submit her own statement. It was a procedural violation significant enough that a lawyer would have flagged it immediately, but Iron Ridge didn't have lawyers, and the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to catch this kind of thing operated on a timeline that assumed good faith from the people being overseen. Torres found her in the barracks that afternoon, sitting on her bunk reading the remediation paperwork. It's in your file already? Torres said. Yeah. Torres sat down. They can't do that before you submit your response. They did it. Avery. Torres stopped, chose her words. This goes beyond hazing. This is falsified documentation. This is a formal record. This could follow you. I know. Then why are you... Torres looked at her, at the way she was sitting, at the quality of her stillness. You're not panicking. No? Why not? Avery looked up from the paperwork. Torres was watching her with the sharp-eyed attention that had been there from the first morning, the attention that noticed the gaps between what people say and how they carry themselves. Avery had liked that about her from the beginning. It was the kind of attention you could be honest around. Because panic doesn't fix documentation problems, she said. Working the documentation problem does. Torres was quiet for a moment. Have you done this before? This specific thing? Someone constructing a paper case against you? Avery looked at the remediation package. Something like it. And I'm still here. Torres sat with that. Then she stood up, went to her footlocker, and came back with a thumb drive. I run PT video every morning. It's my own equipment, my own recordings, habit from my last unit. She held it out. I don't know if there's anything useful on it, but it's documentation that didn't go through this facility's systems. Avery took it. She looked at it for a moment, then at Torres. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Just don't get pushed out. The week that followed was the facility operating at full institutional pressure, and Avery operating under it the way a diver operates under depth, adjusting, not surrendering. Every assignment came with a complication. She adapted to each one and documented the adaptation. Range days. Her ammunition allocation twice came up short. She recorded the discrepancy, shot within her reduced allocation, and still scored in the top third of the group. She submitted formal shortage reports through the supply chain both times. The first report was lost. She filed the second in triplicate, keeping a copy in her personal gear. Medical training rotations. She was assigned the most technically complex scenarios without preparation time that other trainees received. She'd worked through similar scenarios before, not here, not officially, not in ways she could reference on a standard form. She completed them anyway, doing the kind of improvisational triage management that only comes from having been in situations where improvisation wasn't a training exercise. Garrett noticed. He didn't say anything, but he stopped making marks on his clipboard when she performed and started making them afterward, which was a different behavior pattern than the one he'd had in week 1. The physical punishment came through PT modifications, additional sessions appended to her schedule, heavier weight requirements on ruck evaluations, obstacle repetitions added to her individual assessment that didn't appear in anyone else's record. She completed everything. She did it without outward complaint, without requesting modification, and without the kind of visible suffering that might have satisfied the people engineering the pressure. That last part was, she understood, what frustrated them most. They were running a script that had worked before. The script said, apply enough institutional pressure and discomfort, and the person either breaks visibly, giving you documentation of emotional instability, or they request transfer, giving you a clean resolution. Both outcomes served the same function. What the script didn't account for was someone who could absorb the pressure without breaking and without leaving, and who documented everything quietly without making it a confrontation. She was costing them something. She could feel it in the way Pierce had stopped looking at her directly in group settings and started talking about her sideways, referencing performance gaps in general briefings, asking integrated team contributions questions in debriefs that were structured to highlight her name without using it. It was sophisticated as these things went. She'd seen more sophisticated. She'd also seen what happened when people running this kind of operation encountered something they hadn't built the script to handle. They escalated. The escalation came on a Wednesday, during a vehicle operations training block. The afternoon exercise was a convoy scenario. 4 vehicles, 12 personnel, simulated hostile interdiction en route to a mock objective 12 miles into the basin. Standard stuff for the facility. The scenario brief assigned Avery as the convoy's sole medical element, a role that carried specific positioning requirements: secondary vehicle, port side, direct radio access to the convoy commander. The radio she was issued had the same degraded battery issue as before, different unit number, same problem. She caught it during pre-movement equipment check, same as last time, and went to the equipment cage to swap it. The equipment NCO, a young specialist named Aldrin, who had the look of someone who desperately wanted to not be involved in whatever was happening, looked at her swap request and said, "I don't have a spare in that frequency band checked in right now." "What about the emergency comms locker?" "That requires instructor authorization." "Get me Okafor." Aldrin hesitated, long enough to be meaningful. "Specialist," Avery said, keeping her voice level. "I'm the medical element on a convoy exercise that moves in 22 minutes. If my radio fails and we have a simulated casualty, that is a training safety issue, not a performance issue. Get me Okafor, or get me someone who can authorize the emergency locker." Aldrin got on the internal line. He made 2 calls, got redirected twice, and eventually reached Okafor, who authorized the locker over the phone and told Aldrin to log it properly. Avery made the convoy movement window with 4 minutes to spare. The exercise itself was clean until the interdiction point, mile 7, a dry wash crossing where the scenario called for a vehicle breakdown and a simulated casualty requiring field extraction under fire. Avery's role was to exit the secondary vehicle, cross 20 meters of open terrain to the disabled lead vehicle under simulated suppression, and perform a triage assessment while the security element established a perimeter. The scenario brief said the perimeter would be established before medical crossed. When the moment came, the security element wasn't in position. The simunition rounds were still coming from the elevated position to the north, and the perimeter wasn't set, and the instructor observing the scenario, Garrett, standing at a safe distance with a scoring clipboard, said nothing. He just watched. Avery crouched behind the secondary vehicle and evaluated the geometry. 20 meters of open ground, active simunition fire from the north, perimeter not established. The standard protocol said, "Wait for the perimeter." She waited 6 seconds, watching the fire pattern from the north position. It had a rhythm, not random, but cycling, which meant it was 1 shooter on a structured suppression pattern rather than 2 on overlapping coverage. The cycle had a gap. She timed it. On the 3rd cycle, she moved. She crossed the 20 meters in the gap, reached the lead vehicle, got down behind the front wheel well, and started her triage assessment on the simulated casualty, one of the rangers from intake, playing dead with the elaborate commitment of someone who takes training exercises seriously. She found the simulated injury, called the assessment over the radio, requested the extraction equipment, and coordinated the extraction with the security element that finally established the perimeter 40 seconds after they should have. The exercise concluded. Garrett scored the debrief. He gave her a deficiency mark for crossing without perimeter establishment. She looked at the scoring sheet he handed her. "The perimeter wasn't established on the brief timeline," she said. "The protocol is to wait for establishment regardless of timeline." The protocol also accounts for deteriorating casualty status. Under the scenario parameters, the simulated casualty had a time-critical injury profile. Waiting additional time would have resulted in a scenario fatality. "That's not your call to make." "In the field it is," she said. Garrett looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite the contempt she was used to from him. Something more complicated. File a performance review challenge if you disagree with the score, he said. That's the process. She took the scoring sheet. She would file the challenge. She was building a stack of filed challenges, each one small, each one documented, each one requiring a response that Pierce's office would have to generate, and that would eventually constitute a paper record of its own. She was patient. She had learned patience in places where impatience was fatal. Okafor found her at the range cleaning station that evening, breaking down her sidearm with the methodical care of someone for whom the process is automatic enough to leave the mind elsewhere. He sat down at the bench across from her without asking if the space was available. "You timed the fire pattern," he said. It wasn't a question. She kept her attention on the barrel. "Yeah." From behind the vehicle, 6 seconds of observation, then a clean cross in the gap. The perimeter was late. The perimeter was late, he agreed. Garrett knew it was late. The scenario architect built a deliberate delay into the perimeter establishment. He paused. "To see what you'd do." She looked up from the barrel. "You weren't supposed to make it across," he said. "You were supposed to wait and take the deficiency for delayed patient access, or cross without the gap and take the deficiency for unauthorized movement under fire. Two-path scenario, both paths deficiency." She looked at him steadily. "Except I took a third path." "Except you took a third path?" He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn to read fire patterns from static cover?" She put the barrel down carefully. "Training." Okafor nodded slowly, like that was the answer he expected, and also not quite the answer to the question he'd actually asked. He looked at the disassembled sidearm on the bench between them. "I want to tell you something," he said, "not as a facility instructor. Off the record, and I'll deny I said it if you repeat it in a formal context." He met her eyes. "What's happening to you here is not being done by the whole facility. It's being done by a specific subset of people under a specific authority, and that authority is not as secure as it thinks it is." She held his gaze. "How long before that changes?" "Soon." "How soon is soon?" He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, "Keep your documentation. Keep your head down on anything that would give them a clean justification. And when someone new arrives at this facility in the next few days, pay attention to how Pierce behaves in that person's presence." She picked up the barrel again, started reassembling the sidearm. "Who's coming?" she asked. Okafor stood up from the bench. "Someone who makes Pierce nervous," he said. "That's all I'll say." He walked away down the range corridor, his footsteps even, unhurried. Avery chambered the reassembled sidearm and set it down. The range cleaning station was empty except for her, and the only sound was the ventilation system pushing dry air through the ducts. She sat with what Okafor hadn't said and worked through its geometry the same way she'd worked through the fire pattern at the dry wash crossing. Not forcing a conclusion, just reading the shape of the available information and waiting for the picture to assemble itself. Someone who makes Pierce nervous. She'd known a small number of people in her life who had that effect on rooms, on facilities, on the kind of men who ran things with the confident assumption that their authority was the ceiling of any situation they entered. The people who made those men nervous were a specific category. They existed at a level where the normal rules of institutional friction didn't constrain them the same way. She thought about the name on Okafor's contact list, Hale M. She thought about what it sat next to in her deep memory, in the part of her mind where things went that she'd deliberately not visited in years. The name was connected to something operational, something that existed in the geography of events she'd been part of before Iron Ridge, before the medical training detachment, before the version of Avery Stone that existed on official forms and in system databases. She didn't pull on that thread. Not here, not now. She gathered her cleaning kit and walked back toward the barracks. 3 days later, the black SUV with federal government plates arrived at Iron Ridge's main gate at 11:47 in the morning. Avery didn't see it arrive. She was on the range at the time, running a live fire qualification that Garrett had added to her weekly schedule. A qualification that wasn't required for her program track, wasn't listed in the standard curriculum, and had been added to her personal schedule only, which she had documented in writing and submitted to the facility's administrative office. She was mid-string when the vehicle passed through the gate. She finished her qualification string, cleared her weapon, and heard it from Torres at lunch. Whisper network speed, the way significant information moves through contained environments. Someone's here from outside, Torres said, sitting across from her in the mess, keeping her voice at a level that didn't carry. Came in with credentials that had the gate guard on the phone with his CO for 6 minutes before they let the vehicle through. What rank? That's the thing. It's not a standard rank insignia situation. Torres glanced toward the window. Word is it's a general officer, special operations background, unannounced inspection. Avery ate her food and said nothing. She could feel the information settling into the picture she'd been building. Pierce called in all hands for 1400, Torres continued. Full instructor cadre plus all program personnel in the main briefing hall. Did he say what it was about? He said quarterly review. Torres met her eyes. He's never done a quarterly review in the middle of a training cycle. Garrett looked like someone had told him his car was on fire. Avery considered that image for a moment. Finish your food, she said. Don't. The 1400 all hands had the energy of a room that had been rearranged on short notice and was trying not to look it. 60-some personnel arranged in rows, instructors along the side wall, Pierce at the front with the careful composure of someone who has spent 20 years learning to perform composure under pressure. The man who walked in 3 minutes after everyone was assembled was not what the room expected. He was in his early 60s, lean in the way of people who stayed lean, not by trying, but by disposition. He wore no visible decoration that indicated rank to someone who didn't know the specific language of his uniform's quieter signals. He walked like someone who had been places where walking confidently could get you killed, and had learned to walk that way anyway. He had gray at his temples and eyes that didn't perform friendliness or authority. They just looked. He looked at the room the way Avery had looked at the facility layout when she arrived. He was reading it, Marcus Hale. She knew him the moment he walked in, and the moment she knew him, the deep storage memory unlocked, and she understood several things simultaneously. Why Okafor had made a secure call to a non-directory number, why Pierce's composure in the front of the room had a hairline fracture in it, and why the last 3 years of her life had taken the shape they'd taken. She kept her face still. She looked at the second button of the jacket of the person sitting in front of her, and she breathed evenly, and she waited. Hale didn't introduce himself with the usual ceremony. He stood at the front of the room for a moment, hands clasped behind his back, and looked at the assembled personnel in the same steady way he'd looked at the room when he'd entered. I'll keep this brief, he said. His voice was quiet enough that people in the back had to lean slightly forward. I'm conducting a review of this program's training methodology and personnel integration outcomes. My team will be here for 48 hours. During that time, I'll be observing training activities, reviewing documentation, and conducting individual interviews. Participation is not optional. He paused. If anyone has anything they'd like to bring to my attention before the formal interview process begins, my door is open from 1700 today. He looked at Pierce. Instructor Pierce, walk me through the current training cycle. Pierce stepped forward, and Avery watched his face as he did it. The way a man who was used to being the most significant authority in any room navigated suddenly not being that. He was good at it, or good enough. But good enough wasn't the same as good. And there were people in this room who were now watching Pierce with a slightly different calibration than they'd had an hour ago. She filed that. She would go to Hale's open door at 1700. She had documentation to bring, and she had a very specific question about a name on a casualty list from 3 years ago that she had never been in the right position to ask. The briefing continued around her. Outside, the Nevada sky had gone the deep, flat blue of mid-afternoon, and the desert held its heat with the patience of something that had been doing it for a very long time. And the black SUV in the facility parking area caught the sun on its windshield in a way that made it visible from the range, from the barracks, from the maintenance lane, from everywhere that the last 3 weeks had happened. Pierce saw it too. She was certain of that because she was watching him from the second row, and she saw the exact moment, between one sentence and the next, between one breath and the following one, when his eyes went to the window, found the SUV in the lot, and came back to the room. His voice didn't change, but his left hand, hanging at his side, closed into a fist, just once. Then it opened again, and he kept talking, and the room kept listening. And Avery Stone sat in the second row and understood that the geometry of her situation had just fundamentally shifted, that the pressure that had been building in one direction for 3 weeks was about to find a new direction to move, and that what happened in the next 48 hours would determine whether everything she had endured in this desert facility had a purpose, or whether it was simply 3 weeks of being ground down by smaller men who mistook cruelty for authority. She already knew which one it was. She was waiting for the rest of the facility to catch up. At 1700, she knocked on the door of the room Hale had been given at the end of the administrative corridor, a room that had been a storage annex 48 hours ago, judging by the way the shelving brackets were still bolted to the wall above the desk. Whoever had prepped it for him had moved fast and hadn't finished the job. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. Haley was at the desk with a laptop open and 3 manila folders spread in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them said anything. That moment had a weight to it, the specific weight of two people who share a history that doesn't exist in any system either of them can currently reference. He looked older. She had expected that. 3 years did things to people, and the specific 3 years he'd likely had would have done particular things. The gray at his temples was new. The lines around his eyes were deeper. But the way he looked at her, that was exactly the same. Like he was reading the room and she was the most important data point in it. "Sit down, Stone," he said. She sat. He closed the laptop. He didn't close the folders. "You look like hell," he said. 3 weeks of deliberate physical attrition will do that. I read the file they built on you." He tapped the top folder. "It's a competent piece of institutional fiction. Pierce knows what he's doing." "He's done it before." "Yes." Hale leaned back in his chair. "He has. 2 prior instances that I know of. Both resulted in requested transfers. Neither individual pursued a formal complaint." He looked at her steadily. "You haven't requested transfer." "No." "Why not?" She held his gaze. "'Cause I'm not done here yet." Hale was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to ask me why you're here? At this facility? Under this program?" "I've had 3 weeks to think about that question," she said. "I have a working theory." "Let's hear it." "This wasn't a random assignment. The medical training detachment at Bragg processes dozens of personnel through joint training pipelines every quarter. I was specifically placed at Iron Ridge, under Pierce's program, at this point in the cycle." She watched his face. "Which means someone wanted me here. The question is whether they wanted me here because Iron Ridge needed something I could provide, or because I needed something Iron Ridge could provide." Hale didn't confirm or deny either branch. "What else?" "Okafor is yours," she said. "Not his cover assignment, actually yours. He's been here longer than Pierce's current tenure, which means he was placed before the current problems developed, which means someone anticipated the problems or was tracking the conditions that produced them." She paused. "You've been building a case on Pierce. I'm part of the case." The room was very quiet. Hale picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, and set it back down with the mild resignation of someone accustomed to cold coffee. "You were always too good at this," he said. "It wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite a criticism. It was just true." "How long have you been building it?" 14 months. He laced his fingers on the desk. "Pierce's program has processed 63 personnel in 18 months. 11 requested transfer under documented adverse conditions. 7 filed formal complaints that were resolved at the facility level without escalating. In each case, the documentation in their files was weighted against them in ways that impacted subsequent assignments." He looked at the folders in front of him. One individual's career effectively ended. She was a good officer. Avery thought about what Torres had told her. The last person it happened to requested transfer inside 2 months. The paperwork stayed on their record. She thought about the specific grinding mechanics of what Pierce ran here, how it worked, how it kept working because the people it targeted were isolated enough and the documentation was constructed carefully enough that the path of least resistance was always to leave and absorb the damage quietly. "You needed someone who wouldn't leave," she said. "I needed someone who couldn't be broken and could document everything from the inside and would still be standing when I arrived." He met her eyes. "I needed someone who'd already survived worse than Logan Pierce." The sentence sat between them like something that had been waiting a long time to be said. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest that she'd learned over the past 3 years to breathe around rather than into. "You could have told me that when you gave me the assignment. If I'd told you, you wouldn't have come." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He opened the second folder. "I need everything you've documented. Every report, every discrepancy log, Torres's PT footage, the equipment shortage records, the timeline of the fabricated file. He looked up. I also need your formal statement about the maintenance lane incident, in your words, with specifics. She had brought a copy of her documentation. She set it on the desk. Hale looked at the thickness of the stack. Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt and not quite respect, but sharing a border with both. Tomorrow morning, he said, I'm going to conduct a formal review session with Pierce and his instructor cadre. I'll want you available from 0900. Fine. She stood to go. Then she stopped with her hand on the door. The casualty list, she said. She said it quietly, facing the door. Operation Grey Wolf. There were 6 names on it. She felt Hale go very still at the desk behind her. My name was on it, she said. He didn't say anything. Was it a cover? She said. Or did someone in that chain actually believe it? A pause, long enough to be its own answer. Some of both, he said finally. The cover was constructed quickly after the explosion. The assumption, the genuine assumption, for the first 72 hours was that no one in that building survived. When it became clear that someone had, the cover was useful enough that the people who needed it to be true were willing to let it stay true. My family, she said. Yes. She stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the frame. How long before this is over? She asked. Not the Pierce situation. He knew what she was asking. After tomorrow, he said, we'll have a conversation, a real one, not in a storage annex with bolt holes in the wall. She opened the door. She walked back down the administrative corridor through the thin evening light that came through the high windows, and she didn't look at the faces of the 2 personnel she passed on the way, and she breathed evenly, and she held herself the way she'd held herself through worse moments than this one, which was the way her first team sergeant had taught her years ago. Like you're carrying something fragile in the center of your chest, and you don't want the world to know what it is. Mush. Pierce ran the next morning's session like a man performing normalcy. He was good at it. She'd give him that. He stood in front of the assembled training group at 0700 and delivered the day's schedule with the same clipped professionalism he brought to every briefing. And if his eyes were slightly more controlled than usual, if the energy around him had a compressed quality to it, it would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching him carefully for 3 weeks. Avery had been watching him carefully for 3 weeks. The difference this morning was that Hale was in the room, sitting in a chair to the right of the entrance, a yellow legal pad on his knee, making notes without appearing to make notes. He had the ability, rare and specific, to take up almost no visual space while being the most significant presence in any room he entered. People's eyes kept sliding toward him and then away, like there was something uncomfortable about sustaining focus on him. Pierce kept his attention forward. He didn't look at Hale once during the briefing. That cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw. The morning training block was a tabletop exercise, a command and control simulation where teams worked through a multi-phase scenario on paper and whiteboard before going to the field. It was the kind of exercise that revealed how people thought under pressure more than how they moved, and it was the kind of exercise where Pierce could typically control the variables most completely. He'd assigned Avery as the medical planning lead for the blue team, a role that, in a conventional training context, would have been appropriate and interesting. In the current context, it was a stage. He'd set it up to create a specific performance, and she could see the architecture of it in the scenario brief. The blue team's medical planning requirements were layered with conflicting parameters that had no clean solution, which meant any decision she made would be documentably wrong from at least one analytical angle. She'd been given a trap dressed as an assignment. She mapped the scenario variables in 20 minutes, identified the conflict parameters, and spent the next 40 minutes building a planning solution that acknowledged the conflicts explicitly rather than pretending they didn't exist, documenting the trade-off logic, prioritizing based on the scenario's stated mission objectives rather than the medical optimization factors that the trap was designed to make her over-index on. It wasn't a perfect solution. It was an honest one, and honesty, in planning, was something Pierce's framework hadn't anticipated. When the tabletop brief-out happened and she walked through the blue team's medical planning rationale, Hale looked up from his legal pad for the first time that morning. Pierce opened the critique session. The medical planning for the blue team reflects a misunderstanding of the priority framework. I'd like to hear Stone walk through her trade-off logic, Hale said. The room went quiet. Pierce turned toward Hale with the careful movements of someone redirecting a strong current. Sir, the standard critique process, I'm sure it is. Walk me through your trade-off logic, Stone. She walked through it. She was clear, she was specific, and she referenced the scenario's stated mission objectives at each decision point. When she finished, the room was still quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet than before. Hale made a note on his legal pad. Pierce rebuilt his composure in about 4 seconds and redirected the critique toward another team's planning. He did it smoothly enough that a casual observer might have missed the previous exchange as a minor detour. He didn't look at Avery. So, the formal review session Hale had described happened at 09:30 in the administrative conference room, and its existence was communicated to Pierce's instructor, Cadre, 20 minutes before it began, which was deliberate. You don't give people who've been doing something problematic time to align their stories. You give them just enough time to be anxious about not having aligned them. Avery was not in the review session. She was on the range, running the morning qualification block with the rest of the intake group, doing what she was scheduled to do. She heard about the session from Torres at the lunch break. Garrett came out of that room looking like he'd been in a car accident, Torres said. Not hurt, but reconfiguring. You know that look. What about Pierce? Didn't come out for an hour after Garrett. When he did, he went straight to his office. Torres paused. Decker was called in separately, came out in 10 minutes. Decker's 10-minute session was the most informative data point of the morning. An hour-long session with the lead instructor meant a complex interrogation with room to build and rebut a narrative. A 10-minute session with a trainee meant someone had already established the narrative, and the 10-minute session was just confirmation. The session with her came at 1400. Not in the administrative conference room this time. In a smaller office, one of the individual counseling rooms off the main corridor. Hale was there, and a woman Avery hadn't seen before, late 40s, civilian clothes, with the kind of quiet, organized attention that usually meant JAG or IG. This is Ms. Carver, Hale said. She's with the Inspector General's office. Carver nodded once. She had a recorder on the table and a legal pad, and the air of someone who had done this enough times that it had stopped feeling dramatic. Ms. Stone, I'm going to ask you to walk through your experience at this facility from arrival. In your own words, your own sequence, as much detail as you can provide. If I need clarification, I'll ask. General Hale may ask questions as well. She clicked the recorder on. Whenever you're ready. Avery walked through it. She was precise, she was specific. She referenced dates and times and names and document numbers where she had them. She described the maintenance lane incident without embellishment and without minimization. 7 people, what they said, what happened, what she observed afterward. She described the fabricated performance documentation. She described the radio equipment issues, the convoy scenario setup, Garrett's scoring anomalies, the PT modifications that appeared only on her schedule. It took 45 minutes. When she finished, Carver flipped back through 3 pages of her legal pad and asked 4 clarifying questions, each precise, each going to a specific documented gap. Then she said, "One more question, Ms. Stone. The remediation package that was filed in your record on September 19th, do you have a copy of the file timestamp?" Yes. She pulled it from the documentation stack she'd brought. Filed at 1407. I was given until 1500 to submit my response statement. The remediation was in my file 53 minutes before my response window closed. Carver looked at the timestamp. She wrote something. She didn't say what she thought of it, but she wrote it with the particular emphasis of someone writing something they intend to come back to. Thank you, she said. That's all I need for now. Avery gathered her documentation. At the door she paused, looked at Hale. He gave her a small nod, the kind that meant good, and also meant I know, and also meant something else she couldn't parse in the moment. She went back to the range. Tut. The rest of the afternoon passed in the way of afternoons where a decision has been made in one room but hasn't been announced to the building yet. The training continued, the schedule moved forward, people ran their assigned blocks and ate at their assigned times, but there was a different quality to the air, like pressure building toward something. Pierce ran the evening briefing himself, same as always. He was flawless in it. She had to give him that. Whatever was happening in the review process, Whatever he knew or suspected about where it was going, he delivered the evening brief with complete professional composure. But at the end of it, when the group was dismissed, he said, "Stone, a word." She stayed. The room cleared. Garrett stayed too, near the door, arms folded. Pierce waited until the last person was out, and the door was closed. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. He had a different tone now. Not the surface pleasantry of their early encounters, not the quiet threat of the conversation before the maintenance lane. Something flatter, more direct. "Whatever you've told Hale's team today, whatever documentation you've submitted, it's going to be evaluated against the formal record that exists in this facility's system, and that record has been properly maintained." She looked at him. "I know what the record says." "Then you know that your performance documentation reflects a pattern of integration failures and procedural non-compliance that predates any incidents involving my instructors." "I know that's what it was designed to reflect," she said. Garrett unfolded his arms. Pierce studied her for a moment. "I've been running programs like this for 11 years, he said. "I've developed a significant number of high-value operators. I know how to identify people who belong in these environments and people who don't, and I know how to document that distinction accurately." "Do you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I do." He stepped around the end of the table, not toward her but parallel to her, the way someone moves when they want to change the geometry of a conversation without making it look like a physical assertion. "What I don't know, what I'm having difficulty understanding, is what you think the outcome of this review is going to be. Hale can review all he wants. The documentation exists. The process was followed. The documentation was fabricated," she said. "The process was used as a weapon. That's what the review is going to find." Pierce stopped moving. He looked at her with something that might, in a different person, have been close to respect. It wasn't, quite. It was the expression of a man recalibrating the size of the problem he was dealing with. "You're very confident," he said. "I have good documentation." "So do I." She picked up her materials from the table. "Then we'll see whose holds up." She walked toward the door, and Garrett stepped back from it, not quite fast enough to look like it was his idea, but fast enough to clear it. She stopped with her hand on the frame, same as she'd stopped at Hale's door the night before. "Pierce," she said without turning around. "The officer whose career ended 3 rotations ago. What was her name?" Silence. "Her name was Vasquez," he said finally. His voice had changed slightly. "She wasn't a good fit for the program." "Her name was Captain Daniela Vasquez," Avery said, "and she was a good officer, and what happened to her here is going to be part of the formal record." She opened the door. "Good night." She walked down the corridor and didn't look back. The call came at 02:17. She was in her bunk, not asleep. She'd been sleeping lightly since she arrived, which was a return to an old pattern she'd hoped she'd moved past. Her personal phone lit up with a facility internal number she didn't recognize. "Stone," she answered. "It's Okafor." His voice was tight, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Get to the operations center. Now. Don't go through the main corridor. Use the east maintenance path. Move fast and move quiet." "What happened?" "Someone pulled Pierce's full personnel file tonight. Not his facility file. His operational record, the classified one, going back 14 years. A pause. "He knows it was pulled. He's awake." She was already off the bunk, reaching for her boots. "Where's Hale?" "Operations Center. Get there." He hung up. She dressed in 90 seconds, didn't turn on her bunk light, moved through the barracks in the dark by memory. She'd walked it enough times with her eyes closed that the layout was muscle memory now. Through the east fire door, into the dry Nevada air that at 0200 was cold enough to sting, along the maintenance path that ran behind the equipment buildings. The operations center was lit up. She was 40 meters from the door when she heard the vehicles. Not facility vehicles, different engine note, different wheelbase. She stopped and listened, and the sound resolved into 2 vehicles moving without lights, approaching from the west perimeter road that ran along the outside of the facility fence. The road that wasn't on the civilian maps. She stood in the dark and felt something shift in the geometry of the night around her. The same feeling she'd had in other places, at other hours, before things she hadn't been prepared for, even when she'd been more prepared than anyone else in the area. She ran for the operations center. Hale was at the central console with two of his people, the woman Carver and a man she hadn't been introduced to, someone who moved like he'd spent time in the same geography she had. Okafor was at the door when she came through it. "Talk to me," she said. Hale turned from the console. His face was doing the thing it did when he was processing faster than the situation was moving and didn't want anyone to know. "We have a secondary problem," he said. "The file pull tonight wasn't just Hale's IG team reviewing Pierce's record. Someone else pulled it. External access, classified clearance level from outside this facility's system." "Who?" "We're working on that." He looked at her directly. "What I need you to know right now is that the work Pierce was doing here, the program, the documentation fraud, the personnel targeting, it isn't just an internal misconduct issue. There's a connection to something larger that we've been tracking for 18 months. She felt the cold air she'd brought in from outside still on her jacket. "Tell me," she said. "Pierce has been identifying specific personnel profiles through this program," Hale said. "Operators with particular skill sets, technical, tactical, and specifically medical. The ones he documents out of the program aren't washing out. They're being flagged for recruitment." "Recruitment by who?" Hale's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Viktor Dragunov," he said. The name landed in the room like a physical thing. She knew it. She knew it from a context that predated Iron Ridge, predated the medical detachment at Bragg, predated the official version of Avery Stone's service record. She knew it from operations that didn't exist on any file that Carver's legal pad or Hale's laptop could access. "He's active," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's been active for 2 years. We lost visibility on him after the Tashkent operation. He resurfaced 8 months ago under a different operational structure. More decentralized, harder to map. He's been building a network of trained assets, people with verifiable military backgrounds who've been officially documented out of their programs under adverse circumstances. People who have reasons to be angry and skills that are worth paying for. And Pierce was the pipeline. One of them, yes." Hale moved toward her slightly. "Stone, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." "Go ahead." "Viktor Dragunov knows your name." The room was very quiet. "I know," she said. "How long?" "I found out 4 days ago." She watched his face process that. "Anonymous contact through a channel that no one in this facility should have known I had access to. Someone told him I was alive. Someone with access to my operational history." Hale turned back to the console. He said something to the man she didn't know, low and rapid, and the man started working the keyboard. "The vehicles you heard on the perimeter road," Okafor said from the door. He'd been listening to all of it. "They're not facility vehicles, and they're not ours." Hale looked at the security feed on the console monitor. 2 vehicles now stopped at the west perimeter. Dark. No plates visible on the camera angle. "How many personnel in this facility right now?" Avery asked. 63, Okafor said. "Plus Hale's team, 4 people. Security on the perimeter? 4-point coverage, single personnel per post, armed but light. Standard overnight protocol." She looked at the monitor. She looked at the fence line on the tactical map on the wall, the same map she'd memorized from the processing room on her first day here. "The west perimeter has a blind sector," she said, "between the vehicle bay and the maintenance outbuilding. 40 meters, no camera. The motion sensors run on the same grid as the lights that have been reported out of service for 2 weeks. Hale turned and looked at her. "That maintenance ticket," she said quietly, "was never an accident." The radio on the console crackled. It was the West Perimeter Guard, and his voice had the particular controlled tension of someone reporting something they don't have a category for. "Operations. I have movement outside the west fence. Multiple personnel, dark clothing, moving toward the blind sector between vehicle bay and maintenance outbuilding. Request instructions." Hale looked at Avery. The quiet between them lasted less than 2 seconds. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. "You know this facility better than anyone on my team." She was already moving toward the console, toward the tactical map, toward the radio. "Get me a channel to all security posts," she said. Okafor handed her the handset. She keyed it, and when she spoke, her voice was the voice of someone for whom this situation, this specific geography of threat and response, of people in the dark moving toward people who didn't know they were coming, was not new, had never been new, was in fact the voice she'd been using in one form or another for the past 3 years in places that didn't have names and at hours when everything was dark, and the decisions you made were the only thing standing between the people around you and what was moving toward them. All posts, this is Stone. We have a potential breach at the west perimeter blind sector. I need eyes on every alternate approach. East fence, north vehicle gate, south maintenance access. Do not leave your post and do not engage without authorization. Report any movement immediately. Acknowledge by post number. 4 voices came back, one after another. She looked at the tactical map. We have 4 minutes, she said, before whoever is at that fence decides the blind sector is clear and moves through it. Here's what we're going to do. Hale watched her, and something in his expression, the particular quality of it, the mix of recognition and relief, and something that might have been the beginning of an answer to a question he'd been carrying for 3 years, said that this was precisely what he had come to Iron Ridge to find. Not the documentation, not the IG case. This, her, here. The woman who wasn't supposed to be alive in the operations center of a facility full of people who'd spent 3 weeks trying to break her, picking up a radio handset at 0230 in the Nevada desert, and doing the thing she'd always done, taking charge of the geometry. The 4 minutes she'd estimated turned out to be 3. The breach came through the blind sector exactly where the tactical map said it would. 40 meters of dead ground between the vehicle bay's east wall and the maintenance outbuilding. No camera, no motion sensor. The fence cut cleanly at ground level in a place that suggested someone had done a site survey within the last week. She heard it on the radio in the operations center, the West Post Guard, voice-controlled but climbing, reporting movement through the wire. Count? She said into the handset. 6, maybe 8, moving fast. They've got a pause. Something that sounded like the guard repositioning, they've got long guns. Hale was already on a separate channel to his external team. The man she didn't know, she'd started thinking of him as the quiet one, which was accurate enough, was pulling up the facility's interior camera grid on the secondary monitor and calling out positions. They're going to split, she said to the room. 2 elements. One toward the ops center, one toward housing. Standard facility assault pattern. How do you know? Carver asked. She wasn't challenging. She was writing. Because that's how I'd do it. Avery looked at the camera grid. The ops center has the communications infrastructure. The housing blocks have 60 personnel who are currently asleep and unarmed. You control both. You control the facility. She keyed the handset again. All posts. We have active breach west perimeter. Do not pursue. Hold your positions and lock your sector. Anyone not on post, shelter in place. I repeat, shelter in place. Do not move through open ground. She turned to Okafor. What's in the armory? Locked. Pierce has the duty officer key for overnight. She looked at Hale. He pulled his phone, made a call in 3 words. Open the armory. He hung up. My authorization. Carver has the release code. Carver was already moving. The quiet one looked up from the camera monitor. I've got them on the north interior camera. They split at the vehicle bay. 4 continuing east toward the ops center, 4 heading north toward housing. Timeline to housing block? 2 minutes at their current pace. Avery did the math she'd been doing since she first picked up the handset. 63 facility personnel, mostly asleep, no weapons, no warning yet, in a building with 2 entry points and windows that a trained team could use as secondary breach points. 4 armed personnel moving toward it with long guns and a practiced pace. I need someone at the housing block, she said. Not to engage, to get people moving. Interior corridors away from windows and entry points. Is there a hardened interior space? Supply storage room, center of the East Barracks, Okafor said. Cinder block, no exterior windows. That's where everyone goes. She handed the handset to Okafor. You have this channel. I need you on the housing comms. Get Torres on the ground in there. She knows the layout and people will listen to her. She looked at him. Don't let anyone try to be a hero. Where are you going? She didn't answer that. She looked at Hale. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he opened the locker behind the console and handed her a sidearm. A familiar weight, a familiar geometry, and the feeling of it in her hand was like a language she'd been pretending not to speak for 3 years. The team coming toward this building, he said. I know, she said. Stone. His voice stopped her at the door. "Victor is going to be with the element that comes here, not the housing team. He'll want the operations center, the comms, the IG files, everything Carver's been building." She looked at him. "I know that too. I'm not sending you out there alone." "You're not sending me anywhere," she said. "I'm going." She went out the door into the Nevada dark. The night was clear and cold and very quiet in the way that precedes something loud. She moved along the east wall of the Operations Center building using the same low profile she'd used in a dozen environments that were less familiar than this one, because this facility, after 3 weeks, was hers in the way that operational environments become yours when you've mapped them obsessively and moved through them repeatedly and lain awake at night building contingency routes in your head. She knew where the shadows were. She knew where the ground was uneven. She knew the distance between the corner of the ops building and the first vehicle bay access door, 31 meters, measured on a day when she'd told herself she was just getting air. She went to 20 meters and stopped. The 4-person element coming toward the ops center was at the north end of the vehicle bay, 60 meters away, moving in a staggered 2x2 that was clean and trained. Not mercenaries in the movie sense, not chaotic, not loud. These were people who knew what they were doing, which was the kind of threat that didn't let you get comfortable just because you'd planned for them. She identified the spacing. She identified the lead element. She identified the 4th man who was moving differently from the others, not quite in the pattern, slightly back, slightly offset. The way someone moves when they expect other people to handle the foreground and they're conserving themselves for something specific. She knew that walk. Viktor Dragunov moved like a man who had made a long study of making himself hard to read, and had gotten good enough at it that most people missed the tells. She'd spent time in close proximity to him 3 years ago, close enough that she'd learned the tells anyway. Learned them because learning them had been necessary for her survival and for the operation, and because in the end, they were what had let her get out of a building before it came down. Before the building came down on 6 people, and the casualty list had included her name, she noted his position in the formation. She also noted something else. He was limping slightly, right side. Old injury, worsened by terrain or weather or both. She hadn't known about that 3 years ago, which meant it was new. New information, filed. She keyed the small radio Hale's quiet teammate had clipped to her before she went out the door. 4-person element, 60 meters north of my position. Victor is 4th in the formation, limping right. She paused. They're going to breach the ops center from the north entrance. I'm at the east wall. I can take the angle on the lead element when they make the corner. Hale's voice came back low. I have eyes on you from the window. I've got 2 armed personnel on the south exit ready to move on your mark. Not yet. Let them commit to the corner. She watched the formation move. If we engage before they commit, they fall back and we lose the geometry. Wait until the lead pair makes the turn. Copy. The formation moved, 40 meters, 35. Somewhere on the north side of the facility, she could hear something. Not gunfire, but noise, movement, a door. The housing element had reached the east barracks. She heard Okafor's voice on the radio channel, low and rapid, and then Torres's voice, and then the sound of people moving in an organized way rather than a panicked way, which meant Okafor had gotten there in time. 25 meters. The lead pair made the corner. Now, she said. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not cinematic in any of the ways that word usually implies. It was loud and disorienting and not clean. Hale's 2 personnel came out the south exit and took the trailing pair from behind while she moved on the lead pair from the east angle, and the facility's security guards from the east post arrived at the vehicle bay in a vehicle that wasn't supposed to be in motion but was. And the combination of angles and the noise of all of it produced the thing that trained personnel dread most. A situation where the geometry they'd planned for no longer held. The lead element's first man went down from a controlled engagement she didn't have time to be precise about. She moved and he stopped moving, and she registered that without cataloging it because the second man was faster and smarter and had already changed his angle the moment the first contact happened. She hit the ground at the same moment he fired. The round passed high and left. She heard it hit the ops center wall. She came back up from a different position, and the second man was dealing with 2 things at once and couldn't deal with both of them. He stopped. That left Victor. He'd moved during the engagement, not back, not forward, but sideways, into the shadow between the ops building and the vehicle bay wall. She'd anticipated that. She moved to cut the angle before he could use it. He wasn't there. She stopped, back against the wall, and listened. 12 seconds of silence. Then his voice, from somewhere in the dark 6 or 8 meters away. Avery Stone. His accent was mild and precise, the accent of someone who'd learned English from people who spoke it carefully. I read your name on a casualty list. I was sad. She didn't answer. I was sad, he said again, because you were the only person in 3 years of operations who genuinely surprised me. I don't encounter that often. She moved 2 steps left along the wall and stopped. The facility's communications are compromised, he said. You understand that. Whatever your general has been building here, the files, the documentation, my people have been in your system for 4 days. It's already gone. Then why are you here? She said. Her voice gave away nothing about where she was. She pitched it to scatter off the wall angle. To close the file, he said simply. On you. She heard the limp in his movement, the slight, irregular rhythm of it, how it affected the way his weight transferred when he moved laterally. She used it to track him through the dark. He was moving right, trying to put the vehicle bay corner between them. She moved to cut it. He came around the corner and she was already there, closer than he'd expected. Inside the distance where the long gun he'd been carrying was a disadvantage rather than an asset. And what happened was quick and ugly and not clean in any direction. She took a hit to the left shoulder that she registered as pain and then filed to deal with later. He took 3 things in rapid sequence that she delivered with the focused economy of someone who has been in this specific kind of geometry before, in darker places, against worse odds. He went down hard against the vehicle bay wall. He didn't get up. She stood over him breathing harder than she'd like, her left shoulder doing something she was going to have to pay attention to in a few minutes, and she looked at him, at the man who had been the central fact of a 3-year chapter of her life. The reason her name was on a casualty list? The reason she'd lived in the dark for so long she'd started to forget what light felt like. He was alive, breathing. His eyes were open, looking up at her with the specific expression of a man who has been in enough operational situations to know when a situation is definitively over. I had 47 personnel under my operational structure, he said. His voice was still controlled, which she respected on a purely professional level. You've disrupted the infrastructure of 18 months of work. I know, she said. How did you find me? Specifically, how did you track me to this facility? She looked at him for a moment. I didn't track you to this facility, she said. You tracked you to this facility. The moment someone told you I was here, you came. That's the tell, Victor. You always come to close the file personally. He was quiet. That's how I found you in Tashkent too, she said. Just so you know. She heard Hale coming around the corner behind her, and his team, and the facility security who'd been doing controlled movements through the complex for the last 4 minutes, and the sound of the housing block. Quieter now, which meant the personnel there were secured and the second element had been dealt with. She stepped back from Victor and let Hale's people take the geometry. Her shoulder was bleeding. She'd need to deal with that. The after-action processing lasted 6 hours. She spent the first hour in the facility medical bay getting her shoulder looked at by a trauma surgeon who had arrived with Hale's team in the second vehicle and who told her, without excessive ceremony, that the wound was a through and through that had missed anything important, which was lucky, and which she should not interpret as a license to ignore it, which she probably would. I'll take the antibiotics, she told him, and the rest, I'll manage. He did the work he needed to do with the efficiency of someone who'd handled post-operational trauma in field conditions and found a sterile medical bay with overhead lighting to be a relative luxury. She sat through it without theatrics. The pain was real, and she let it be real without making it the center of anything. Torres was in the corridor when she came out of the medical bay, sitting on a folding chair with her forearms on her knees, still in the clothes she'd been wearing when Okafor woke the housing block. She looked up when Avery appeared. 61 personnel secured, Torres said. No casualties in the housing block, 2 minor injuries from people moving too fast in the dark. The second element? Contained. All 4. Hale's team handled the last 2. Torres looked at her shoulder. You're going to have a story to tell. I always have a story, Avery said. I just don't usually get to tell it. Torres looked at her for a long moment, in the sharp-eyed way she'd had since day one. Who are you? She asked. Not accusatory, just someone who had spent 3 weeks watching a person not quite fit any of the categories available and had arrived at the point of asking directly. Avery Stone, she said. Same as it says on the intake form. That's not what I mean. I know. She looked down the corridor. Come find me after the debrief. I'll tell you what I can. Torres nodded. She stood, folded the chair, and walked back toward the housing block. Avery watched her go and thought that in another life, under better circumstances, Torres was exactly the kind of person she would have built something with. A team, a unit, a structure that worked. She'd had that once before the casualty list. She went to find Hale. The formal debrief convened at 0600 in the administrative conference room, which smelled of coffee and a long night and the specific institutional exhaustion of people who have been managing a crisis and are now managing the aftermath of managing a crisis, which is its own distinct and worse thing. Hale was at the head of the table. Carver was beside him with her legal pad, which had more pages turned than it had at the start of the previous day. Okafor was there. The quiet teammate was there. 2 additional personnel from Hale's external team who had secured the perimeter were there, still in tactical gear, coffee in hand, saying nothing. Pierce was not there. She noticed that immediately and filed it. Sit down, everyone, Hale said. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and had no intention of letting that be relevant. We're going to do this systematically. I want a full accounting of the overnight action, and then we're going to address the facility situation, and then we're going to address some other things. He looked at Avery. Stone, you ran the tactical response last night. Walk us through it. She walked through it. Same precision as the IG interview, different content, positions, movements, timing, decisions, and the logic behind them, outcomes, and what produced them. She included the shoulder wound, the duration of the Victor engagement, the specific information Victor had disclosed about the system compromise. 4 days, Hale said when she reached that point. He said 4 days. Yes. That means the file exfiltration started before the perimeter breach, before last night. Yes. Which means the physical operation last night wasn't primarily about the files. She looked at him. He already had what he came for from the system. The physical operation was the closeout, personnel. Specifically you. Specifically me. And the IG case documentation, which he'd want destroyed physically even if he had digital copies, because physical destruction is cleaner in court. She paused. He told me the files were already gone. I don't think that's fully true. I think he got what he could access remotely and came for the rest in person. Carver looked up from her legal pad. The remote access. How did they get credentials? Avery looked at the table for a moment. Someone inside this facility gave them access. The room absorbed that. Pierce? Okafor said. I don't know, maybe. Or someone in Pierce's orbit who has a connection to Dragunov's network that Pierce himself may not have known about. She looked at Hale. Where is Pierce? In his quarters, Hale said. Under escort since 0300. He knew something was coming last night? We believe he received a communication yesterday evening. We're pulling his device logs. Hale set his coffee down. Stone. I need to tell the room some things. Some of them you already know. Some of the people in this room don't know all of it, and they need to. He looked around the table. What I'm about to say stays in this room until the formal disclosure process is complete. That's not optional. Nods around the table. Hale folded his hands. Avery Stone's official service record reflects a career as a combat medic with a medical training detachment assignment. That record is accurate in the same way that a photograph of one room in a house is accurate. It shows you exactly what it shows you and nothing else. He looked at her with something direct and without apology in it. Prior to her assignment here, Stone operated for 3 years under a classified designation in a joint interagency task force that no longer officially exists. Her operational specialty was a combination of tactical medicine and direct action, a combination that is exceptionally rare and that the task force used in high-risk penetration operations in environments where standard military assets couldn't go. The room was very quiet. 3 years ago, Hale continued, Stone was part of a 6-person team conducting an operation targeting Viktor Dragunov's weapons distribution network in a location I'm not going to specify in this room. The operation resulted in a structural explosion that killed 5 members of the team. Stone survived. The operational cover required that her survival remain classified, for mission continuity reasons, and because Dragunov believed she was dead, which gave her ongoing operational value. Okafor looked at his coffee. He already knew this, but hearing it said out loud in a room formally appeared to be doing something to him that he was managing quietly. The cost of that decision, Hale said, was that Stone's family and prior unit were not informed of her survival for 3 years. He paused. That was a decision made above my pay grade. I want to be clear about that. Avery looked at the table. I disagreed with it, Hale said. For the record. She didn't say anything. The quiet teammate cleared his throat. The task force, is it still operational? No. It was dissolved 14 months ago following a review that is also classified. The personnel who were part of it have been in various transitional assignments since. He looked at Avery. Stone's assignment here was the final operational use of her task force designation. After this, her record returns to standard channels. What does that mean practically? Okafor asked. It means she gets to exist again, Hale said simply. The room processed that in its various ways. Carver had stopped writing. The 2 tactical personnel near the door were looking at her with expressions she recognized. Not quite awe, because awe was what civilians felt, and these were not civilians. It was the specific recognition of people who understood what the operational landscape she'd been in actually looked like, and what 3 years of it alone would cost. She felt their recognition, and she sat with it, and she didn't know quite what to do with it, which was honest. Pierce's formal interview happened at 0900. She wasn't in the room for it. She was in the corridor outside. Not by accident, not because she'd asked to be there, but because Hale had told her to be there, and she'd decided not to ask why until after. The conference room door was closed. She sat on the bench in the corridor with her left shoulder aching at a steady, manageable frequency, and she drank the coffee Torres had brought her without being asked, and she waited. She could hear voices through the door, not words, but patterns. Pierce's voice had a controlled quality to it for the first 20 minutes, then something changed, and the control wasn't exactly gone, but it had less range. She heard Carver's voice twice, precise and short. She heard Hale once, a long passage that she couldn't parse through the door. At 0947, the door opened and Carver came out. She looked at Avery with the expression of someone who has just completed a task that needed doing and feels about it the way you feel about necessary medical procedures. He's asking to speak with you, Carver said. Avery looked up. You don't have to, Carver said. It's not part of the formal process. He specifically requested it. She thought about it for 6 seconds. Okay, she said. She went in. Pierce was at the conference table, no longer at the head of it. He was at the side, and the positioning told her everything about how the last hour had gone. Hale was still there, in a chair to the left. Carver resumed her seat. The room had the tired, compressed quality of a space where significant things had been said and couldn't be unsaid. Pierce looked at her. He looked like a man who had been running a very long race on a road he was certain of, and had arrived at the end of it to find the road stopped. I don't know what you expected to happen, he said. Not hostile, so something past hostile, somewhere in the flat country beyond it. I didn't expect anything, she said. She sat down across from him. I documented what happened, that's all. You documented it very specifically. You gave me a lot to document. He exhaled through his nose. The Dragunov connection, he started. Stop, Hale said. Anything related to last night goes through the formal record. That's not what she's here for. Pierce looked at Hale, then back at Avery. He was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you leave? He said. When I offered the transfer, clean record, no flag. You could have walked away. Vasquez couldn't, she said. The name landed in his face like something physical. His jaw tightened. She was a good officer, Avery said. I didn't know her, but she was a good officer, and what you built here ended her career, and she left quietly because there was no one here to make it cost you anything. She held his gaze. I'm not Vasquez. He looked at her for a long time. No, he said finally. You're not. She stood up. She was done. There was nothing more she needed from this room or from this man. She'd gotten what she'd come to Iron Ridge for, which wasn't justice in any clean sense, because nothing in operational reality came in clean forms. It was something more like documentation, evidence, the kind of record that travels. She went to the door. "Stone," Pierce's voice. She stopped. "For whatever it's worth," he said. "The assessment scores. Your actual performance scores. Before my people weighted them." He paused. "You were the top-rated trainee in this cycle, by a significant margin." She didn't turn around. "I know," she said. She went back to the corridor. Wholesome. The facility spent the next 4 hours in the controlled aftermath of an overnight crisis. Personnel accounted for. Positions documented. Federal law enforcement arriving from the Las Vegas field office in 3 vehicles at 10:30, the kind of institutional processing that is necessary and exhausting and makes everything that happened feel both more real and more distant simultaneously. Carver's team worked the digital forensics on the system breach, working backward through 4 days of access logs. What they found took 2 hours and confirmed what Avery had suspected. The remote access credentials belonged to a facilities administrator who had been in Pierce's extended orbit for 9 months. Not a direct subordinate, not listed in Pierce's official chain, just someone who shared meals with him occasionally and who had a financial record that would become very interesting to investigators in subsequent weeks. Dragunov, with 7 of his personnel under federal custody and his operational network's Iron Ridge component exposed, was processed through the facility's medical bay for the injuries he'd sustained the previous night and then transported by Hale's team. He didn't speak again after the vehicle bay. He sat in the medical bay while the trauma surgeon assessed him, and he looked at the ceiling, and he had the expression of a man doing complex internal accounting. She saw him once more, briefly, when they moved him through the corridor. He looked at her as he passed. She looked back. That was all. At 1300, Hale found her in the East Training Yard, the same yard where Pierce had come to her with his 4-person orbit in week 3, the same concrete and the same desert light, and the same metal fencing with the same wind coming through it. She was sitting on the divider wall, not doing anything in particular. Her shoulder ached. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been running on operational adrenaline for many hours and is now experiencing its absence. Hale sat beside her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The desert held its heat with its usual patience. "Pierce," she said, "formal charges? Multiple counts of document fraud, filing false official reports, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. Carver's team will add to it over the next week." He paused. "Garrett cooperated with the IG interview this morning. He's not going to face criminal charges, but his certification is under review. He'll be out of instruction by the end of the month." "Decker, formal separation proceedings. The maintenance lane assault combined with the false statements. There's enough for involuntary separation. His record will reflect it." She nodded. She thought about Vasquez, about the weight her record had carried out of this facility, about the fact that there was no retroactive fix for what that cost. Some damage didn't come with restoration. "The personnel file on Vasquez," she said. "Can it be reviewed?" "It's already been flagged for formal review," Hale said. "I can't promise an outcome, but it'll be looked at by people who aren't Pierce." She looked at the fence line. "And the personnel Victor flagged through this program, the 11 who transferred. We'll find them. Some of them may have made choices we can't undo. Some of them may not have made any choices yet. They were just identified. We'll reach them." He looked at the same fence line she was looking at. One at a time. She sat with that. "My family," she said. Hale was quiet for a moment. "There's a process for the official notification. It goes through a liaison who handles this kind of Marcus." He stopped. She looked at him. "My family. How long?" He held her gaze. He looked for a moment like what he was, a man in his early 60s who had made decisions in the service of things he believed in and was carrying the specific weight of decisions that had cost other people in ways he couldn't fully account for. 72 hours, he said. "I'll handle it personally, not through a liaison." She looked at the desert. "Okay," she said. The wind came through the fence and moved the dust across the training yard, and the sun was at its afternoon position, flat and honest, and making no promises. And she sat on the concrete divider wall where 3 weeks of a specific kind of pressure had been applied to her and absorbed by her and documented by her. And she breathed, and her shoulder hurt, and she was tired, and she was still there. That last part mattered. She'd learned a long time ago that staying was the thing. Not winning, Not performing, not being recognized. Staying, being exactly where you were and not being moved from it by people who wanted you somewhere else. She was still in the yard. Pierce was not. That was enough for now. Torres appeared at the edge of the training area, hands in her pockets, and looked across at Avery with a question in her expression. Avery tilted her head slightly. Come on, then. And Torres crossed the yard and sat on the divider wall on her other side. And for a few minutes, all three of them, Torres, Avery, Hale, sat in the afternoon light and said nothing, which was its own kind of thing. Not peace, exactly. Not yet. But the shape of it. The beginning of the shape of it. And the desert held its heat, and the fence stood, and somewhere in the administrative building, Carver's team was building a record that would travel. And 48 hours from now, the phone would ring in a house that had spent 3 years with the wrong information about what had happened to one of its own. And that wrong information was going to become right information, which was not a clean process and would not feel clean when it happened. But it would happen. She was going to make sure of that. The 72 hours Hale had promised turned into 58. She found out because Torres knocked on the barracks door at 6:40 the next evening and said simply, Hale wants you in the admin building. And the way Torres said it, careful, gentle, like someone carrying something breakable, told her that the call had already been made, that it was done, that whatever was on the other side of the next 10 minutes was already in motion and couldn't be stopped. She washed her face. She changed her shirt. Her shoulder was stiff and the antibiotics were making her slightly nauseous, which she was managing by eating crackers and ignoring it. She walked to the admin building in the evening light, which at this hour turned the Nevada desert into something that looked almost deliberately beautiful. The red basin going gold, the fence line throwing long shadows, the sky doing the thing it did out here, where it became very wide and very blue and then very purple, and there was nothing between you and it. She walked through it and didn't think too hard about what she was walking toward. Hale met her at the corridor outside his office. He had his phone in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something careful and human that sat oddly on a face she associated with operational control. I reached your sister, he said. First, she was the contact I had from the original file. He paused. She handled it better than most people would. She's been waiting for a while, I think. Not for this specifically, but for something, some resolution. Avery's jaw tightened slightly. She felt it and let it. She wants to speak with you, he said. When you're ready. Is she on the line now? No, she needs a few minutes. She said, he looked at the phone briefly. She said to tell you she's not angry. That was specific. She wanted me to say it exactly. She looked at the floor of the corridor for a moment. She knew I'd need to hear that first, she said. Yes, he said. She seemed to know that. Avery stood in the corridor for a moment with the desert light coming through the high window at the end and the sound of the facility running its post-crisis normalization around her. Voices at a distance, a vehicle moving outside, the ventilation system doing its work. Give me 5 minutes, she said. Take what you need. She went to the east end of the corridor, where the high window looked out over the training yard, and she stood there and looked at the yard and didn't do anything in particular for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She thought about her sister, who was 3 years older and had the family's practical gene and had probably, in the time she was gone, done the things you do when you're waiting for something that doesn't come. The paperwork, the documentation, the slow administrative process of reclassifying someone from present to absent. She thought about what it cost to wait for something like that without knowing you were waiting. She turned around and went back to Hale and said, Okay. He handed her the phone. The call lasted 41 minutes, and she sat on the floor of the corridor with her back against the wall, because at some point her legs didn't want to do the standing anymore, and the floor was available. Hale went somewhere else and gave her the corridor, which she appreciated without being able to express it at the time. Her sister's name was Dana, and she had a voice that was 2 degrees lower than Avery's, and a way of saying things that was direct in the way of someone who had learned to be direct because the people around her responded better to it. And the first thing she said when the call connected was exactly what Hale had said she'd say. I'm not angry. Okay, Avery said. Her own voice came out smaller than she intended. I want to be clear about that before anything else because I know you and I know that's the first thing you'd be waiting for. Yeah. I'm not angry, Dana said again. I was.
For a long time, I was very angry, but that's mine to deal with, not yours. And right now, A pause, and the sound of Dana doing what Dana did when she was managing something, which was exhale slowly through her nose. I just need to know you're actually there. On the other end of this. Actually there.
I'm here, Avery said. A longer pause. Okay, Dana said. And then, very quietly, okay. They talked. Not about everything. There was too much everything to talk about in 41 minutes, and both of them knew it, and neither of them tried to pretend otherwise. They talked about the practical things first, the way their family tended to approach difficult things. Because the practical things were easier to hold, and they were both people who needed something to hold before they could put down what they'd been carrying. Dana had handled the estate paperwork. There had been a formal declaration 18 months after the operation, when the window for further information had closed and the official process required a resolution. She'd handled it with the same precise competence she brought to everything, and she'd kept a file of everything she'd done. And she said, without drama, that she'd now need to undo most of it. I'll help, Avery said. I know you will. A pause. Mom thinks you're dead. The sentence sat between them on the phone. I know, Avery said. She's been... Dana stopped, started again. She's okay. She's been okay. But she's been carrying it, and she doesn't carry things lightly, and I think when I tell her... Another pause. I think it's going to be a lot. I know. Can you come home? Avery looked at the corridor ceiling. The paint was institutional beige with a water stain in one corner that looked like it had been there for 20 years. She looked at it for a moment. Yeah, she said. I can come home. When? I need a week, maybe 10 days. There are things here that need to be closed properly.
Okay. Dana's voice had shifted. Something in it had released slightly, like a muscle that had been contracted for a long time and was starting carefully to let go. Avery. Yeah. I'm glad you're not dead. Me too, she said. She heard Dana laugh, a short, unpracticed sound, the kind that comes out when something is too much to hold in any other form. And then the call continued, and the corridor light changed as the Nevada evening settled into dark outside the high window. And at the 41-minute mark, Dana said she needed to go, because she had to figure out how to tell their mother. And Avery said that was fine, and they agreed to speak again in 2 days, and the call ended. She sat on the floor for another 3 minutes. Then she got up, and she straightened her jacket, and she went to find Hale. The formal processing of Iron Ridge Tactical Center's situation took the better part of the week that followed, and it had the quality of all large institutional reckonings. Significant and grinding in equal measure, full of paperwork and formal statements and procedural steps that felt both necessary and interminable. Pierce was transported to a federal holding facility in Las Vegas on the second morning, pending the formal charge filing that Carver's team was building. She watched the vehicle leave from the window of the East Barracks and felt something that wasn't satisfaction. Satisfaction was too clean for what it was. It was more like the feeling you get when a structural problem in a building is finally acknowledged by the people who built it. Not relief, exactly. More like the end of a particular kind of strain. Garrett's certification review was initiated by the end of the week. He had cooperated with the IG process, and his cooperation was genuine. She'd seen the look on his face in the debrief when the full scope of what Pierce had been running became clear in the room, and it was the look of someone who had participated in something that had grown into something larger than what he'd originally signed on for. That didn't exempt him from accountability, and Carver's process reflected that. But it produced a different outcome than Pierce's, administrative rather than criminal, which was its own kind of finality. Decker's formal separation proceedings began on day 4. He had a lawyer by day 5, which was his right, and which changed the timeline but not the destination. Viktor Dragunov was transferred to a federal facility with a classification level that meant his name disappeared from the paperwork Avery could access, which was frustrating in a practical sense and appropriate in every other sense. What she knew was that 18 months of operational infrastructure had been exposed. 7 of his personnel were in federal custody, and the network of documented-out military personnel he'd been building as a recruitment pool was now known to the people who needed to know it, and being worked through one name at a time. The 11 personnel from Pierce's program who'd been flagged, she asked Hale for updates on each one, twice.
He gave her what he could. 3 had been contacted. 1 had made no contact with Dragunov's network despite being identified. They'd been flagged but never approached, or approached and declined. 2 had made contact. 1 had done something that would require a separate legal process entirely. She sat with that, with the specificity of it, and understood that this was the part of operational work that nobody built stories around. The outcomes that weren't clean, the threads that didn't resolve tidily, the people who fell through gaps in the process and kept falling. She filed the updates, and she didn't pretend it was finished just because her part was. On the 6th day, Hale called a full facility assembly. 61 personnel in the main briefing hall, the intake group, the remaining instructors, the security staff, the administrative personnel, the logistics NCOs who kept the place running and had spent the week working around the aftermath of a federal investigation with the pragmatic resilience of people accustomed to institutional disruption. They filled the rows of chairs and they stood along the walls, and the room had the slightly altered energy of a group that had been through something together and was still figuring out what it meant. Avery sat in the second row, same chair she'd been sitting in when Pierce had walked through the door on her first day. She'd chosen it deliberately, not as a statement, but because she was a person who needed to close loops in the small ways when the large ways were still being processed. Hale stood at the front of the room. He spoke for 15 minutes. He covered the formal aspects, what the investigation had found, what the outcomes were for the personnel involved, what the next steps for the facility and the training program would be. He was clear and precise, and he didn't use language that softened the edges of what had happened or made it easier to absorb than it deserved to be. Then he said, "I want to address something directly." The room went quiet in a specific way. This facility's training program functioned for the past 18 months as a mechanism for targeting and removing personnel who didn't fit a particular mold. Some of you knew that and participated in it. Some of you knew it and didn't intervene. Some of you genuinely didn't know. And I want to be clear that those are meaningfully different situations that will be treated differently. He looked around the room. What all of you should understand is that the program's targeting didn't work the way it was designed to, because it encountered someone it couldn't process. He looked at Avery. Staff Sergeant Avery Stone documented every procedural violation, every falsified report, every incident of deliberate harassment over 3 weeks, while also completing every assigned training objective and maintaining her position in this program under sustained institutional pressure. He paused. And when this facility faced a threat that its security infrastructure couldn't handle, she managed the tactical response. 61 of you are in this room this morning, in part because of decisions she made between 0217 and 0300 on Thursday. The room was very quiet. She looked at the second button of the jacket of the person in front of her, and she breathed evenly, and she let the words be what they were without trying to do anything about them. "Sergeant Stone," Hale said, "please stand." She stood. She didn't look at the room for a moment. Then she did, because she'd learned that looking away from things didn't change them, and that looking at them directly was most of the time the less expensive option in the long run. The room looked back at her. Not uniformly. There were faces in the rows that were processing the moment in ways she couldn't read, and there were faces that carried the specific discomfort of people reckoning with 3 weeks of their own behavior. Those faces were doing something important, she thought, even if it was uncomfortable. Maybe especially because it was. Okafor started clapping first, then Torres, then moving through the room, others. Not all of them, not a unanimous standing ovation, because this was not that kind of moment and she wouldn't have wanted it to be. But enough. Enough that the sound filled the room and meant something. She sat back down when it finished. She was not going to cry in the main briefing hall at Iron Ridge Tactical Center in front of 61 people. She was also, she acknowledged privately, closer to it than she'd been in approximately 3 years. The conversation she had been waiting for with Hale happened on the 7th day, in the storage annex office with the bolt holes still in the wall, the same room where she'd handed him her documentation a week earlier and asked him about the casualty list. The difference this week was that 2 cups of coffee were actually hot. "What do you want?" he asked. He said it directly, without framing, which she appreciated. She turned the cup in her hands. "I want my record corrected." "Done. It's already in process.
Full service record with the classified addendum integrated under the appropriate security framework. Your 3 years of task force operations will be reflected in a form that can be accessed by anyone with the appropriate clearance. He looked at her. You'll also be receiving the formal commendations for the Tashkent operation. Those have been sitting in a classified file for 3 years. I don't need commendations. I know you don't need them. You're getting them anyway. He held her gaze. What else? She set the cup down. Vasquez. Her file review is already initiated. I know. I want to be kept informed of the outcome. I'll arrange that. He wrote something. What else? She looked at the bolt holes in the wall above the shelving brackets. The personnel from the task force, the other units, the people I worked with in the 3 years. What's their situation? Various. Some are back in standard assignments. Some transitioned out of service. 2 are still in active classified roles that I can't discuss in detail. He paused. If you're asking whether they're okay, most of them. Some of them are managing things the same way you're managing things. Which is what? One day at a time and mostly fine. She almost smiled. Almost. What are you offering me? She said. He'd been waiting for that question. She could tell from the way he settled slightly, the way people settle when a conversation arrives at the point they've been building toward. There's a program, he said. Not here. This facility is going to undergo significant restructuring before it runs another training cycle, and that's going to take months. A different location, smaller. The concept is a training program for personnel with combined tactical and medical qualifications. The specific profile that's currently underleveraged across every branch. People who can operate in environments where you can't have separate medical and direct action elements. He looked at her. The program needs someone to design it and run it. She looked at him. Not as an active operator, he said. As the architect. You design the curriculum, you select the instructors, you set the culture. You build it the way you think it should be built, based on 3 years of operating in environments where that combined capability was what stood between people and not surviving. She thought about the training scenario in the CQB building, about the fire pattern she'd read from behind a vehicle, about the 41-minute call from the floor of a corridor, about 61 people in a briefing room. If I design it, she said, I design it entirely. You don't get to route personnel through it for reasons that aren't training related. Agreed. Instructor culture is mine. I don't inherit anyone from the existing pool without individual review. Agreed. And I need 6 weeks before I start. Personal time. He nodded without hesitation. 6 weeks. Take 8 if you need it. She picked up her coffee. I want Torres, she said. She's got the instincts and the documentation discipline. She'd make a good instructor. Talk to her yourself. If she agrees, I'll process the assignment. She drank the coffee. It was still hot, which remained a minor surprise. She sat in the storage annex with the bolt holes in the wall and the Nevada morning visible through the single high window, and she thought about what she was agreeing to and what it would cost and what it might produce. And she thought about a phone call from a corridor floor and a sister saying, I'm glad you're not dead. And she thought about 11 names in a file that were going to be reached one at a time by people doing the slow, unglamorous work of finding the gaps in a network before the network used them. Okay, she said. Hale extended his hand across the desk. She shook it. She left Iron Ridge on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after she'd arrived in a transport van coated in red dust. The difference was that this time she was in the passenger seat of a facility truck that Okafor was driving to the regional airport, and the transport van wasn't part of the picture. Okafor drove the way he did everything, competently, without drama, with a quiet attentiveness to the road that she'd come to associate with him as a general quality. They drove the 40 miles northeast of nothing in the early morning light, the basin opening up around them, the mountains doing their blue-gray thing at the edges of the sky. What are you doing after this? She asked. Hale's got me at the new facility location for the site assessment. He glanced over. Pre-construction review. Apparently they want someone who knows what doesn't work. You're good at that. I've had practice. He was quiet for a moment. What's the first thing you're going to do when you get home? She thought about it. I don't know yet. I've been thinking about it, but I don't have an answer. That's an honest answer. It's an accurate one. She watched the road. I think I'll eat something bad for me. Probably in the car before I get to the house because I won't want to walk in carrying fast food. Okafor laughed. It was a real laugh. She hadn't heard one from him before,
and it was a good sound. That's very specific, he said. I've thought about it more than I admitted. He drove. The basin scrolled past. Somewhere behind them, Iron Ridge Tactical Center was undergoing the institutional equivalent of what a building undergoes after a structural inspection finds significant problems. People moving through it with clipboards and authority, documenting what was wrong so it could be made right, slowly, in the grinding, non-cinematic way that real repair actually happens. Okafor, she said. Yeah. Why did you stay there? 14 months under Pierce. It was a long time. He was quiet for a moment. The road straightened out ahead of them, long and flat, and going toward a horizon that was exactly what it appeared to be. Because the people he was pushing out were real people, he said. They were good. They were doing the right work, and he was using the system to get rid of them. And somebody had to stay and watch. Somebody had to be inside it, documenting, so that when the time came, the documentation existed. He paused. Same reason you didn't leave when he offered you the transfer. Yeah, she said. Yeah. He adjusted his grip on the wheel. It's a hard way to do the right thing. Most right things are. They drove the rest of the way without talking much, which was comfortable in the specific way of being comfortable with someone who doesn't require performance to feel at ease. At the airport drop-off, she pulled her bag from the truck bed and he stayed in the driver's seat and she looked at him through the open window. Thank you, she said, for the call you made, for staying. He nodded once. Go see your family, Stone. Working on it. She went inside. The flight home was ordinary in the way that ordinary things become briefly remarkable when you've been away from them for a long time. The recycled air, the small overhead light, the mechanical reliability of a thing doing exactly what it was built to do, taking you from one place to another through unremarkable sky. She slept for most of it, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to be able to sleep. But her body had apparently decided that the operational debt of the past month was due and was collecting, and she woke up 40 minutes from landing with her head against the window and the clouds below the plane catching the afternoon light in a way that looked exactly like it looked every time, that specific quality of white and gray and the landscape emerging through it. She ate the fast food in the rental car as she'd planned. It wasn't particularly good and she ate all of it, and it was exactly right. The house looked the same. That was the first thing. That it looked exactly like it had 3 years ago. The same paint on the trim, the same tree in the front yard that had been getting too big for that spot for as long as she could remember. The same quality of late afternoon light making the porch look warmer than anything deserved to look in a world where the paperwork was what it was and the documentation took the time it took. Dana's car was in the driveway. She sat in the rental for a moment with the engine off. Not because she was afraid. She'd stopped being afraid of this specific thing about 48 hours ago, had moved through something while she was sleeping on the plane that she couldn't precisely name, but that felt like the end of a particular kind of bracing. She was sitting because she wanted to remember this moment, the one just before, when everything was still about to happen and hadn't yet. Then she got out and she walked up to the door and she knocked, because it wasn't her house in the way it had been her house, and she understood that and wanted to acknowledge it. Dana opened the door. She was taller than Avery remembered, which wasn't possible, but that's how memory worked. It made the people you'd lost slightly smaller, slightly softer, slightly less present in their physical reality. Dana was none of those things. She was exactly herself, which was tall and direct and had the family's dark eyes and a look on her face that Avery couldn't have described if someone had asked her to. They stood in the doorway for a moment. "You're here," Dana said. "Yeah." Dana hugged her. It was not graceful. Avery's shoulder made a complaint that she absorbed and ignored, and Dana was taller, and the angle was slightly wrong, and they were both people who didn't do this smoothly under normal circumstances, and these were not normal circumstances. It lasted longer than either of them would have predicted if you'd asked them beforehand. When Dana stepped back, her eyes were doing something she wasn't doing anything to hide. "Mom's in the living room," she said. "She doesn't... I told her someone was coming. I didn't tell her who." Avery looked at her. "I thought..." Dana stopped. "I thought it should be you. That she should see you, not hear me say it first." "Okay," Avery said. She walked past Dana, through the hallway that was the same and had the same smell. The particular combination of the house, of the specific quality of its rooms, and into the living room where her mother was sitting in the chair she'd always sat in, watching the window. And when she heard footsteps, she turned around, and her face did the thing that faces do when the thing happening is too large for any prepared response. And she made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't anything else either. It took a while. All of it took a while. That was how it should have been. In the weeks that followed, Avery Stone did the things that people do when they've come back from somewhere they weren't supposed to come back from. She sat in rooms that felt both familiar and foreign. She ate meals that tasted the way she remembered them, and also slightly different because she was slightly different. She had the phone call with Dana about the estate paperwork, which was administrative and necessary and strangely clarifying. So, all those forms, all that documentation, being undone and reconstituted as the correct version of events. She called Torres on a Thursday morning, 12 days after leaving Iron Ridge. "The program Hale described," she said when Torres picked up. "Are you interested?" A pause. "Tell me about it." She told her. Torres asked 7 specific intelligent questions that went to the parts of the proposal that were genuinely unresolved. And then she said, "Who else are you bringing in?" "I don't know yet. I want people who've been in combined environments, people who understand what it costs when you have to separate capabilities that should be together." She paused. "I want people who've been through something and came out with their judgment intact." "That's a specific pool." "It's a real one." Torres was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Yeah, I'm in. I need 8 more weeks. I'll be here." She hung up. She sat in the kitchen of her mother's house with the morning coming through the window and the tree in the front yard doing its too large for that spot thing, and she thought about the program she was going to build. Not what it would look like from the outside, not the organizational chart or the curriculum headers, but what it would feel like from the inside. The culture of it. The daily texture of training in a program that was built around the truth of what people could do when the capabilities were combined correctly, and the people running it understood why. She knew what it should feel like because she knew what the absence of that felt like. She'd been living in the absence of it for 3 years in environments where it would have saved lives and didn't exist. She started writing it down. 8 weeks later, she stood in front of a room of 23 people, prospective instructors, assembled from 7 different units and 3 different branches, none of them from Iron Ridge's old cadre. And she delivered her first briefing for what was now formally designated the Combined Tactical Medicine Integration Program, operating out of a facility in a location that was neither Nevada nor nowhere, that had actual functional motion sensors and a perimeter that someone had checked recently, and an armory that operated on standard issue protocols. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the 23 people who had been recruited because they fit a profile that she and Torres and Okafor had spent 6 weeks defining. And she thought about the divider wall in the Iron Ridge training yard and the first morning PT formation and the way the desert light moved across concrete at 5:30 in the morning when you haven't slept and you're deciding whether to be there or not. "I'm going to tell you one thing before we get into the program structure," she said. "This program exists because people in combined environments kept dying because the people who could save them weren't there. Not because the capability didn't exist, because it was organized wrong. Because the people who had both sets of skills were being filtered out of the places they were needed most, and nobody was building anything that kept them in." She looked at the room. "We're fixing that. It's going to be slow, and it's going to be detailed, and there's going to be a significant amount of documentation." She paused. "Any questions before we start?" She paused. "Any questions?" A hand went up near the back. A medic from a ranger battalion, compact, serious-faced, who had the look of someone who had seen enough to be cautious about rooms making promises. "Why you?" he said. "Why are you running this?" The room stilled slightly. She looked at him. "Because nobody else was," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded and put his hand down. She opened the briefing document and began. 3 months after that, in a different city, in a federal courtroom where the proceedings were public record, and the gallery had a handful of reporters and a larger handful of the people. Pierce's program had processed out over the past 18 months. Logan Pierce was formally arraigned on 4 counts of filing false official statements, 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and one count related to the Dragunov network connection that the federal prosecutor described as an ongoing matter with additional charges pending. He pleaded not guilty. The trial date was set for 7 months out. Avery was not in the courtroom. She was in a training bay 1,200 miles away, running a force-on-force scenario evaluation with 6 of her new instructors, watching the way they handled a 3-versus-1 engagement problem, and noting where the decisions were clean and where they needed work. Torres brought her the news about the arraignment at the lunch break, reading from her phone. Pierce pleaded not guilty, Torres said. Okay. Garrett's certification was formally revoked this morning. She scrolled. It's in the IG's public report. Good. She closed the evaluation binder she'd been writing in. Did the report mention Vasquez? Torres scrolled further, found it. Her personnel file has been formally reviewed, and the remediation documentation from the Iron Ridge period has been designated as falsified and removed from her record. The report recommends review of assignments made subsequent to her departure from the program. Torres looked up. That's the dominoes falling. Yeah. Avery picked up her coffee. It'll take time, but they'll fall. She had spoken to Daniela Vasquez once, on the phone, 2 weeks earlier. The conversation had been short and specific, and the most important thing about it was that Vasquez had already started the process of appealing the assignment decisions that followed Iron Ridge, and she had documentation of her own, and she had a lawyer who understood the IG report well enough to use it, and she was not, in any sense of the word, done. She's going to be fine, Avery had told Hale afterward. I know, he'd said. She called me too. The program ran its first full training cycle in the spring, 24 personnel, from 4 branches, in an 8-week combined tactical medicine integration track. The attrition rate was lower than Iron Ridge had reported for any comparable cycle, which was explained partly by selection and partly by something harder to quantify, a training culture that was built around the assumption that the people in it deserved to be there until they demonstrated otherwise, rather than the reverse. 2 participants struggled with the physical standards, and she worked with them through it rather than around them. One of them made the standard by the final week. One of them didn't, and she sat with him in the debrief and told him directly that this cycle wasn't the right fit, and here was what she thought the path forward looked like. And he left without a fabricated file, and without a remediation flag, and without the specific kind of damage that Iron Ridge had specialized in. She didn't sleep well every night. She had the shoulder, which healed wrong in one specific movement pattern, that her physical therapist said was going to require deliberate management for the foreseeable future. She called home every Sunday, and sometimes those calls were easy, and sometimes they were the complicated kind that happened when people were rebuilding something at the same time as they were learning who they all were now, which was slower work than any operational timeline could accommodate. She did it anyway. On a Friday afternoon at the end of the first cycle, she stood at the edge of the training bay and watched 24 people who had just completed something genuinely difficult gather their gear and debrief in the informal way that groups do when it's over. Small clusters, some laughter, the particular looseness of bodies that had been under sustained physical pressure releasing it. Torres came and stood beside her. Good first cycle, Torres said. Mostly. The 2 who struggled with the standards, I know. She watched the room. We adjust the selection criteria before the next intake. The physical standard is the right standard, but the assessment protocol can be tighter on the front end. I've been thinking the same thing, Torres crossed her arms. The CQB evaluation on day 32 also needs restructuring. The scenario parameter was too narrow. It was essentially testing one decision model instead of adaptability. Build me a proposal. I want it before the end of next month. Already started it. They stood there for a moment, watching the room. Okafor's coming for the second cycle, Torres said. Hale cleared the assignment. I know. He called me. She paused. I'm glad. Outside the training bay windows, the afternoon was doing what afternoons did in this part of the country. The light going slightly golden, the temperature starting to drop in a way that you could feel at the edges of things before you could fully feel it yet. It was different light than Nevada. Softer. More variable. She stood in it and she was 34 years old, and she had a shoulder that needed deliberate management and a program that needed structural refinement and a family that was in the ongoing process of relearning who she was, and she had Torres beside her, and she had a phone call scheduled with Dana for Sunday, and she had 24 people in a room behind her who had learned something real. That was not everything. But it was what was true right now, and right now was what she had, and she had learned, in the specific, unglamorous, repetitive way that things are learned when they cost something, that right now, held carefully and taken seriously, was enough to work with. More than enough. She went back inside to begin the next thing. She notes, the quietest people in any room are often the ones who have already survived battles loud enough to break most people. Never mistake stillness for weakness. Sometimes it's the only thing left standing after the storm has passed through everything else.